Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, colleagues, friends. Welcome to the chamber. I call to order the informal interactive hearing of the General Assembly with Indigenous Peoples held in accordance with the Resolution 71/321 of the 8th of September 2017 and Decision 76/560 of the 26th of April 2022. In accordance with the customs of the indigenous peoples and the recognition of the peoples of these lands, we will now hear the traditional welcome by Mr. Brennan Ferguson of the Tuscarora Nation. Mr. Ferguson.
Choe Eskenaha, Rachagwasta Gyatha, Disna Rakwiski Saseta, Skarure, Diwagafnutna, Disna Skarure, Gayadakra, Diwakneana. So, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Brennan Ferguson. I'm from the Tuscarora Nation, and I'm here with the Haudenosaunee External Relations Committee. And today I was asked to open our meeting in accordance with Haudenosaunee custom. And I'll start in my own language and then I'll interpret afterwards. Una thwata na jadi ha kanyut ne kina haratas. Una wagahaf gaguri waya egihra kinika uri wa. Una hasna na wa twet yagwa wetwa na ina agat kwaini. Thwat diga kath ne ginika diga wadakya. Una hasna yagwat de rutra disna natnwat nana haratas disna yagwari huatatha twa ha ekwage hana afnakya hanat neo ne kat yagwat dige rutna una chakwat dige ran una hasna twa kat dige rad etwas disna neki na haratas hat yagwa ufna het tuasna twa yagwari huatatha twa ha ganikka yakia wig twa ha negwadawa juha kiana ari yagwat tag disna nekwa Twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas twat ha rabadia giana ha ufna getna era disna ura yega hasna yagwadi hua tatha ha yagwa ufna hanat neo ne kat yagwat digehrutna una chakwat digehrad una hasna twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas twat ha awage ha na afnakya disna nekwa and what digehra rutra disna wa yuhra yagwadi hua tatha twa ha kadi ge ha na uawaga disna twa geche ge ha na awage ha hasna yagwadi hua tatha ha awage ha na hana neo ne kat yagwat digehrutna una chakwat digehrad una hasna twa kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas twa ha uhye ha na afnakya wat ka na ragu ha wisad agadachi una nekwa Twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas twa utwa ge ha na afnakya wat kat na ragu ha notakwa agadachi hasna yagwadi hua tatha twa ha unaha ge ha na ha uthahera ge ha na disna twa ha gachat wat ge ha na afnakya hasna yagwadi hua tatha twa ha uhye ge ha na disna twa ha utwa ge ha na afnakya hana neo ne kat yagwat digehrutna una chakwat digehrad Una hasna, twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas, twat ha gadiu ge ha na afnakya, wat kat na ragu ha aqua agadachi, hasna yagwadi hua tatha ha gadiu ge ha na. Una hasna, twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas, twat ha ura ege ha na afnakya, wat kat na ragu ha ujiketa agadachi, hasna yagwadi hua tatha ha ura ege ha na. Hanat neo ne kat yagwat digehrutna una chakwat digehrad. Una hasna twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas twat hat jitna ge hat na afnakya wat kat na ragu hat staguia agadachi una nekwa twat yagwadi hua tatha twat ha uesa jitna ge hat na afnakya hanat neo ne kat yagwat digehrutna una chakwat digehrad. Una hasna Twat kat digehrad et was disna neki na haratas ha hetdak digarakya hasna en wat digehrarutra ha atukya uskutke wewaradet dias disna hat wat netket Hesna yagwadi huatata hatak digarak ya. Anak niu nekat yagwat digah rutna. Una chakwat digah rad. Una hesna tuat kat digah rad etwas disaneki neharatas hat yagwas hat yagwariasu ge hat nahit nege hagat. Disna hat yagwariachi hita. Disna hat yagwasu athanya hat. Una nekwa tuat yagwadi huatata hat. Tuat hat yutni sera dawe ure yaga. Anak niu nekat yagwat digah rutna. Una chakwat digah rad. Una hesna tuat kat digah rad etwas disaneki neharatas hat yichi guwana skanat dariyu. Hesna sachi raweru wahra tuat hat ruwet dawa hat rawat diah na hat tarahawakya. Hesna yagwadi huatata hat yichi guwana skanat dariyu. Anak niu nekat yagwat digah rutna. Una chakwat digah rad. Una hesna tuat kat digah rad etwas disaneki neharatas hat rawat diah na hat tarahawakya. Una chuakya and what digah rarutra tuat hat rawat diah kia na ha ufna na era dis na ura higa. Hesna yagwadi huatata hat rawat diah na hat tarahawakya. Anak niu nekat yagwat digah rutna. Una chakwat digah rad. Una yagwat dihua get yagwat dathnasu. Una chakwat digah rad. Una hahatu. So to just briefly interpret what I just said. Thank you. So again, this is an ancient custom of the Haudenosaunee. Whenever we get together and for important matters, it's important that we use these words as a tool to bring all of our minds together, because our ancestors then, as well as our people now, understand that in order to get work done, everyone has to be kind of thinking on the same page. And our ancestors developed this method and this tool by simply acknowledging all the different levels of creation and grounding ourselves in where we fit in creation. And so when I start, I first acknowledge everyone that has made it here today. And I offer my thanks and my gratitude that everyone has been able to attend this meeting and that they made it here safely and that they made it here with health. And then we extend that to all other people of the world that aren't here with us today. After we acknowledge the people, we start with our mother, the earth. And we give thanks to the earth. And we acknowledge that the Creator gave her a tremendous amount of responsibilities. And we offer our collective gratitude that she has continued those duties and those responsibilities because we're so dependent on it. From that point, we work our way up back to the Creator's land. And along the way, we mentioned the waters and all of the animals of the water and all the fish of the water. And again, we express our collective gratitude here with one mind. We express our gratitude that all of these different things in the waters and associated with the waters have continued their responsibilities given to them by our Creator. And again, we keep moving up, and along the way we mentioned the fruits and the different food plants and the different medicinal plants, the trees, and each time we're taking our collective mind, that's all of our mind is one unit. And we give our thanks and we offer our gratitude towards all these different components of creation. We move our way up into the sky, into the sky world, and we recognize all of our relatives that dwell within the sky. I mentioned our grandfathers, the thunderers, the sun, who we refer to as our elder brother, the moon, which we refer to as our grandmother. And in the same manner, we use our collective mind to greet and acknowledge those things, and again, thank them for continuing their duties. We get to the Creator's land, and I mentioned that along our travels as a people, we've come across really hard times at different points. And in each of those times, He has sent us messengers, people that can carry the words of the Creator, and they remind us of how to conduct ourselves. And I offer our thanks for those messengers because they have allowed us to survive into the future. And lastly, I get to the Creator, and again, with our collective mind, I acknowledge the Creator, and I offer our thanks, and I say we're all very grateful that we can continue to go outside and see everything that we need. And I give him our thanks that we can go outside and we can see all that he has put on this earth for us. And I give him our collective gratitude for everything that he has done for us. And then at the end, I mentioned that this is as far as our words are going to take us. And if I had forgotten anything, I ask that each of you fill in those blanks. If you feel like I had missed something or there was something that you feel should be mentioned, that you fill it in your own mind, because I didn't mean to offend anybody by forgetting something. Una hatu, yawa.
Mr. Ferguson, thank you very much indeed for your beautiful words, for beautiful notions, ideas, on behalf of all who are here in this chamber, on behalf of all those who are following us online in the Americas, in Europe, in Africa, in Asia and Australia. The wisdom that came from your word is very much instructing us. We need to bring together our minds and actions together. Many, many thanks to you. Ladies and gentlemen, distinguished indigenous representatives, excellencies, friends, once again, let me thank Mr. Brennan Ferguson of Tuscarora Nation for his beautiful words and beautiful ideas. We have waited a long time to commence this third interactive hearing. We are not only picking up a conversation that started 6 years ago in the 71st session of the General Assembly and was postponed due to the pandemic, but we are revisiting a cause brought before the League of Nations 100 years ago by Chief Cayuga Deskake. The chief traveled to Geneva representing the 6 nations in Canada to advocate for their rights, to live freely on their lands, to practice their religion, and to follow their own law. In 1923, his requests were denied. The door was closed in what he called cruel indifference. Since this sad chapter, the United Nations has gradually opened the door and broadened the participation of indigenous peoples in its work. We are here today to continue building on these efforts to fulfill promises made, one, in the Declaration on the Rights of the Indigenous Peoples, recognizing participation not only as a right, but also as a valuable contribution to work at the UN. Two, in the 2014 outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples, to recognize consultations on enabling participation of indigenous peoples' representatives in the institutions in relevant UN meetings. I'm convinced that no government has a monopoly on wisdom. It is essential that throughout the negotiation processes, we should consider the views of indigenous peoples, particularly when it comes to managing natural resources, preserving cultural and religious values, and taking decisions affecting the lives of indigenous communities. While member states are the decision makers, it's an intergovernmental organization, indigenous peoples have an opportunity to significantly shape those decisions. Indigenous peoples must have those opportunities. Yet we need to answer the critical questions of access and participation that have eluded those before us and made the United Nations a difficult place to navigate. And I have to acknowledge that difficulty. The discussions used to turn around the following issues. Who is indigenous? Who decides who is an indigenous representative for the purpose of the United Nations accreditation? How to apply the principle of regional balance, including with existing sociocultural regions? In which bodies should indigenous peoples participate and how? I acknowledge that the indigenous peoples are not often organized as NGOs, and not always. And that is an issue that can give rise to confusions for some. As indigenous peoples, you express yourself in great diversity, as federations, autonomous governments, parliaments, and community-based decision-making bodies. While some member states formally recognize these institutions, others may not. In some cases, you might even be part of the governments. Or, I know of some, you might even lead governments, national governments. I take note of the 2020 outcome of the dialogue meeting in Quito to establish a coordinating body of indigenous representatives. I invite all participants today to reflect on innovative and appropriate ways in which indigenous peoples' right to participate can be respected and enhanced. Greater participation will only augment the legitimacy of decisions adopted in the United Nations and assist member states in their implementations. But we may not limit our discussions today to the issue of the access. The issue is not only about the participation. The big take is how to contribute to the transformation of this world we all need. In the wise words of the Dakota, we will be known forever by the tracks we leave. It is my hope that we do our part today to close regretful chapters of the history and begin writing a new chapter, one of rightful participation and inclusion and shared wisdom. I am here to listen and to help turn the page. We are, after all, in the house where we used to say, "We the peoples," the first three words of the UN Charter. Let us ensure that the UN lives up to its ideas, to its charter, and to the notion of leaving no one behind. Thank you very much. At the outset, I'd like to inform participants that those wishing to speak during the interactive dialogue are kindly requested to press the button located at the base of the microphone in order to be placed in the list of speakers. Representatives of the Secretariat will walk around in the room to ascertain the names of the participants wishing to speak. Once the name has been inscribed in the list, your microphone button will be deactivated and reactivated when you take the floor. I now give the floor to Mr. Dario José Mejía Montalvo, Chair of the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues.
Muy buenas tardes, muchas gracias, estimado Su Excelencia, señor Kasaba Korosi, por sus amables palabras, por estar acá, por aperturar Y también quiero dar las gracias al señor Ferguson por sus palabras de armonización, por su bienvenida y por todo aquello que nos ha deseado en esta jornada y en el proceso que sigue en adelante. Esperamos que sea muy productivo también. Saludo a las delegaciones de los Estados miembros, a las delegaciones de los pueblos indígenas, al señor presidente del mecanismo de expertos sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas de las Naciones Unidas, excelencias, damas y caballeros todos, muchas gracias por estar acá. El principio de participación que nos guía a todos en estos escenarios tan necesarios en estos momentos de crisis global, efectivamente debe ser liderado y promovido por la presidencia de la Asamblea General. Por eso doy gracias porque se aperture nuevamente este escenario después de los momentos críticos de la pandemia que obligaron a suspender los anteriores momentos. Yo creo que la conferencia mundial sobre pueblos indígenas y su producto, documento final, marca un hito muy importante porque en este lugar los Estados miembros reconocen a la Declaración de los Pueblos Indígenas para que sea la guía de trabajo entre los pueblos indígenas, las agencias y los mismos estados. En este marco sí es muy importante que se sigan definiendo acciones muy concretas en los distintos niveles. En estos días que hemos estado escuchando las deliberaciones en el marco del foro permanente, también hemos escuchado con preocupación que en muchos lugares del mundo, aún a nivel nacional, no se avanza con planes de acciones concretos para implementar la declaración. Pero no obstante, este no es un motivo para que a nivel global no avancemos, sino que por el contrario debemos impulsar los procesos. Y si bien es cierto, en este momento estamos aquí en una situación donde tenemos que entre todos conversar cuáles son los pasos a seguir, yo creo que también es importante que los procesos que llevan las Naciones Unidas se articulen. Y en este sentido, a pesar de las dificultades propias de la pandemia, de las dificultades propias de la comunicación, creo que podemos considerar que hay un enorme trabajo adelantado. Porque paralelamente hay un proceso que se denomina revitalización de la Asamblea General. Yo invito a que este proceso sea incorporado no para ser considerado como parte de la sociedad civil, sino cómo mejorar la participación de los pueblos indígenas en el sistema de las Naciones Unidas, pero particularmente en ese proceso de cómo revitalizar la Asamblea General. Entonces, siempre es bueno explicar por qué los pueblos indígenas no son ONGs. Agradezco mucho sus referencias porque claramente este es un punto de partida. A veces, cuando le agregamos complejidad a los procesos de negociación, generalmente se nos demoran un poco más, pero cuando recurrimos al sentido común, generalmente avanzamos mucho más. A veces tomamos el camino de ponernos de acuerdo en lo que queremos, pero también a veces es importante tomar el camino del sentido común, de lo que no somos. En este sentido, yo destaco, por ejemplo, que en el taller que se hizo recientemente en Ginebra, hubo una metodología bastante amigable, donde las personas, los Estados miembros, los pueblos indígenas se pusieron de acuerdo en lo que no son los pueblos indígenas, sentido común. No son ONGs, no son sociedad civil, no son estados, ¿sí? Pero tampoco son observadores. En cuanto ya estamos de acuerdo en lo que no son, entonces queda evidente que necesitamos crear, necesitamos reconocer, porque no están viniendo de la nada, siempre han estado ahí, antes de la creación incluso de los Estados miembros. Y la sociedad civil, por ejemplo, es una creación propia de diferenciación que es de los estados modernos. Luego, todos estos trabajos ya avanzados son una contribución, no son caminos separados. Es como lo decía en la mañana de hoy en la declaración del gobierno de Colombia, la distinguida señora embajadora, los pueblos indígenas son como un gran río donde confluyen distintos riachuelos y finalmente todos van al camino de aportar las soluciones al diálogo. Yo por eso quiero destacar enormemente su voluntad y invito a que en adelante identifiquemos unos momentos, unos lugares comunes y no dejemos marchitar este proceso. No lo dejemos marchitar. Por el contrario, este es un momento muy oportuno para revitalizarlo, para fortalecerlo, para encontrar los lugares comunes. Sentido común nos permite impulsar las voluntades, nos permite crecer en las voluntades. Nosotros como mecanismo especial estamos muy interesados, hemos puesto empeño, queremos aportar. Tanto es así que en el pasado el grupo de trabajo que se conformó, a quien reconozco su enorme esfuerzo, nos ha pedido que ayudemos a identificar qué país quiere alojar un esfuerzo de reunión autónoma de los pueblos indígenas. Y como ustedes ya saben, en la rueda de prensa de apertura del foro permanente, la ministra indígena de Brasil ha anunciado que quiere alojar la reunión Alta más 10 como un antecedente que esperamos nosotros la próxima asamblea, la próxima resolución del tercer comité pueda ya incluir la realización de la segunda conferencia mundial y que este sea un punto de llegada para este proceso donde ya encontremos resultados muy importantes. Y en este periodo hay que reconocer también que las agencias de la ONU han creado en algunas instancias algunos mecanismos de participación que, si bien todavía no son ideales, sí son importantes reconocerlos, como por ejemplo en cambio climático, en la conferencia sobre diversidad biológica. Recientemente tuvimos la conferencia global de aguas, allí hubo voluntad para escuchar las delegaciones de los pueblos indígenas. Todavía no como es el ideal, pero sí son pasos pequeños que hay que reconocer en las modalidades y que yo espero se junten todos, esos riachuelos se juntan todos para el gran río que finalmente es la vida de todos y de todas. Yo les deseo muchísimos éxitos, pido que no se marchite, por el contrario, se revitalice el proceso, todos juntos para aumentar la participación de los pueblos indígenas a partir del sentido común que siempre acrecenta las voluntades. Muy amables.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much indeed. You have my word. It is not going to be a one-time event. I would like to invite you to now embark jointly during my presidency and hopefully during the presidency of my successors. What we need to achieve to unite the wisdom as it was suggested by Mr. Ferguson at his greeting words at the beginning. We need you. We will be much richer with you, and our solutions that we iron out together will be much more lasting and much more serving all of us on this planet. To embark on it, let me mention that, as indicated in the program, this informal interactive hearing consists of an opening segment, here we are, a panel discussion and an interactive dialogue. It will be held all in this room. The panel discussion will take place immediately right now. So the interactive dialogue will follow the panel, and the whole meeting will last until 6:00 p.m. this evening. Now I would like to invite the panelists to take their seats at the podium to switch immediately to the panel discussion. We shall first hear the presentations by the panelists, and thereafter the floor will be open to comments, observations, and panelists. So I would like to very much extend on behalf of you a warm welcome to Mr. Kenneth Deere, Chief Administrative Officer to Indigenous World Association, Professor Claire Charters at the University of Auckland, and Mariam Wallet Abu Bakrin, President of Tin Henan Association. You're very much welcome on board. So I would like to offer the floor to Mr. Kenneth Deere.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. President, and thank you for your wonderful speech, too. I think you stole all my thunder. My name is Atsahiyandu. In my language, it means the fire still burns. I'm a Bear Clan, Mohawk Nation, one of the 6 nations of the Haudenosaunee, also known as the Six Nations Confederacy or the Iroquois Confederacy. We have a matrilineal society, so my mother is Bear Clan, so I am Bear Clan. I am who my mother is. And the women, we have a society, it's a matrilineal society, and it's the role of the women to nominate who will be the chiefs, because it's the women that raise the children, and they are the ones that understand who will be the best leaders, who knows our culture, who knows our language, who knows the ways of peace, the way to keep the peace among our families. So we are a people that have a governance structure that predates European contact. As a matter of fact, we don't even know how old it is. That's how long that we have existed. So we are a government. We are not an NGO. We are not a non-government organization. We have our own civil society. We have our own ways of our women, our children, our different medicine societies, the different functions of our people. It's all organized inside our nations and inside our confederacy. So as a nation, we feel that we've always felt that we are sovereign. We have relationships with other nations. We have treaties with European powers. We are all treated equally. We always see ourselves equally to everybody else. So when we started having difficulties with, in this one particular case with a country called Canada, we sent, when we couldn't get satisfaction in the domestic situation in Canada, we decided that we had, as a sovereign and independent people, we sent a delegate to the League of Nations. As the President has previously said, his title name was Diskahe, a Cayuga chief. And his name, his title is not, his name was Levi General. Diskahe is a title that's handed down from generation to generation by the women from time immemorial. So Diskahe went to the League of Nations in 1923 to ask to address the League as a sovereign, self-determining people. And he was stopped from speaking because states like Canada and others stopped him from speaking, even though there were some states like the Netherlands, Estonia, and Persia, Iran today, supported Diskahe to speak at the League. But he was still stopped from speaking because they said that, well, you're not a member, so you can't speak. So he says, okay, we're not a member, so we'll apply for membership. And the Haudenosaunee formally applied to the League of Nations to be members. And by subterfuge, his application was never dealt with. According to the rules of the League of Nations, all applications for membership would go to the floor for a vote. But because there was some resistance through world powers, his application was never brought to the floor to be voted upon. And so he's stopped from applying. His application to the League was stopped. And we always wonder, when we look back, what would happen? What would the world be different if the Haudenosaunee were elected to the League of Nations in 1924? And I think that the world might be a different place. Discahe had to leave Geneva and went home. He never returned to Canada for fear of being arrested, and he died in Tuscarora, where Brendan Ferguson lives. No, he died. Yeah, he died in Tuscarora a few months later, never returning home. Today, the situation still remains the same. After the United Nations was born in 1945, indigenous peoples were not taken into consideration in the creation of the United Nations. And today, the same situation relies where Discahe cannot address the United Nations. In 2019, the current Discahe, his name is Steve Jacobs, went to the Human Rights Council in Geneva, and he also refused to register as an NGO. So when we had a hearing about enhanced participation, Discahe stood up in the room, silent, not being able to speak, and somebody else with NGO status, sat in front of him and spoke and pointed out to Discahe, saying, "This man is still silent today because the United Nations will not let him speak as a nation. He won't let him speak as a leader of a people." And the symbolism was so striking that people today, indigenous peoples, our chieftainship titles, cannot address the Human Rights Council or the General Assembly. Today, in 2023, in the 21st century, Discahe still cannot speak, still cannot address the League, cannot address the United Nations General Assembly, it cannot address the Human Rights Council. So after 100 years, this has to change. We challenge the United Nations that in 2024, 100 years after he left Geneva without speaking, that Discahe can address and speak as a nation, speaking as a chief of his people, as a leader, as a political leader, to address the United Nations. 100 years should be enough time for the countries in the world to recognize the self-determination of indigenous peoples. It's time. We can't wait another 100 years for this. And we're not coming to the United Nations to complain. We're here to contribute to the United Nations. We're here because we are part of humankind. The United Nations can't just survive as a group of nation states. Nation states do not represent everybody. Indigenous peoples need to be represented because the United Nations needs to reflect all peoples in the world, not just nation states. And indigenous peoples are peoples equal to all other peoples. And there has to be a place for indigenous people here because we have something to contribute. We have a voice. We have something to say. We have something to make this a better world. We have things to say about climate change. We have things to say about racism. We have things to say about world peace. We have teachings that we can share with you. We have teachings that can maybe help you solve the issues that you face today. As the United Nations today is not really united. We can help make you united if you have a way to reflect all of the peoples in the world. And that's what we're here to do. We're here to make sure that we can take a place in the United Nations, to make the United Nations a better place, and we're here to help you do that. And we have a way of doing that. If you would listen to the voice of indigenous peoples, we can participate. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. President. Yes, sir?
Thank you much, Mr. Kennedy. Thank you for your wise words. A couple of minutes ago, I invited you for a journey. We made the first step on this journey now. Let's make the second step. Let me offer the floor to Professor Claire Charters at the University of Auckland.
E rōnanga tēnā mā, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I just want to pause a minute from my notes to thank you so much, Kenneth, for reminding us so eloquently why we're here. And I also want to acknowledge also Ratana, who was Māori, who came here at a similar period of time. So thanks so much for that, Kenneth. Ngā mihi nui ki a koutou mā. My name is Claire Charters and I'm from Ngāti Whakaue, Tainui, Tūwharatua and Ngāpuhi. And I speak here as the former advisor to the President of the General Assembly in 2016 and 2017, together with Professor James Anaya and alongside the permanent representatives of Finland and Ghana. I just want to acknowledge the extraordinary efforts made at the time by Indigenous peoples representatives, state delegates, our friends at the Office of the President and the DESA Secretariat as well. I saw Brodie earlier. And to our partners of GEAR and DOSIP, for example, who stand by our side in every major international development to realise our rights. It was an extremely intense negotiation in which people worked until the early hours of the morning for many weeks of negotiations that took place over 18 months. The determination to find a consensus to creatively find solutions was truly remarkable. Sweat and tears were shed in these very rooms by seasoned diplomats and Indigenous peoples representatives alike. And while there were states that could not support a resolution to enhance Indigenous peoples' participation, I commend all states for their professionalism and courtesy at that time. But I also hope that they have been able to reflect carefully on their objections, on ways that they might be addressed and come to renewed negotiations with open minds and open hearts. I hope they will appreciate that their fears are unfounded and, on the contrary, that greater equity and fairness can be achieved if Indigenous peoples' participation is enhanced across all bodies of the United Nations. So here I hope to provide a brief but frank and honest description of that process to enhance Indigenous peoples at that time, in the hope that in re-entering these negotiations, we do so with our eyes open and we focus on the main issues. So I just want to add to Kenneth's comments, and you certainly did steal my thunder too and more, thanks Kenneth, that Indigenous peoples do have the right to self-determination and that the denial of Indigenous peoples' right to join international organisations from the League of Nations onwards is a direct consequence of colonial thinking under which Indigenous peoples were not considered to be human. As such, European and other powers could justify their classification of our territories as empty, available for discovery, and refuse to recognise our sovereign authority. Let's be clear then that the enhancement of Indigenous peoples' participation at the UN is a process of decolonisation and equality. Currently, formally Indigenous peoples cannot participate as self-determining entities outside of the permanent forum and expert mechanism. And even then, that participation is realised through an administrative loophole rather than as of right. So we as advisors back then, after 4 pre-negotiation consultations with states and Indigenous peoples, identified 4 main elements that would require agreement. First, venue; second, modalities; third, the accreditation process; and finally, the criteria for selection of Indigenous peoples' representative organisations. The process was initiated then at the General Assembly because it was a parent body in one form or another to the ECOSOC, to Human Rights Council, amongst others. And a General Assembly resolution would pertain to all its subsidiary bodies and have influence across all UN bodies and international organisation. So while there was not quite consensus on venue, the negotiations proceeded on that basis, namely that Indigenous peoples would participate in the General Assembly and its committees as well as its informal meetings. Permanent observer status was a bottom line. Second, in my mind, the modalities were probably the least contentious at that time. On the one hand, there was little support from states for Indigenous peoples to vote in the General Assembly. and many Indigenous peoples did not seek voting rights per se, but nonetheless robust participation and effective participation was on the table, and especially in particular committees. So the major contention at that stage was between who would ultimately determine the Indigenous peoples' representative organisations who would qualify for participatory rights and how that process would work. This issue overlapped clearly with the criteria on which Indigenous peoples would be selected, and especially whether state recognition of Indigenous peoples was a necessary requirement. So we explored various alternatives in multiple drafts with nuanced differences. Trade-offs were sought between selection processes that did not permit any state a veto, but made state recognition a mandatory requirement. Then there was the alternative that state recognition would not be required, but the process might provide opportunities for states to object to the selection of that particular Indigenous people's representative organisations, albeit with safeguards in place. So arguments from states that could not accept the various drafts prepared by the advisors included mainly focused on the concern that non-Indigenous peoples might be identified as Indigenous peoples when they especially did not recognise them as Indigenous peoples. For Indigenous peoples and most supportive states, it was imperative that, first, the resolution did not undermine the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and especially our right to self-determine who we are. Second, that we uphold equality between Indigenous peoples and alongside states. And third, that we remain unified and not leave out some Indigenous peoples. There was a concern that only some of our brothers and sisters would qualify for participation. I certainly agree with the view that regional representation is needed in the negotiations, and I'm glad that there has been time to bring Indigenous peoples globally together, and I want to commend the Indigenous Coordinating Committee for that role. But there are some steps that we must take at the restart of this process, and these include establishing a roadmap for the adoption of a resolution, having learned from previous processes, guaranteeing the inclusion of Indigenous peoples throughout the entire negotiation process. It was somewhat ironic that at those final stages that Indigenous peoples could not enter the room to speak about enhanced participation. And then finally, that we ensure transparency, collaboration, honesty, and integrity. So to finish, in the interests of equality, morality, and legal imperatives, I sincerely hope that we have reached the right moment in time to find the consensus required to formally and strongly endorse the enhanced participation of Indigenous peoples at the UN. From the bottom of my heart, I ask delegations to be generous, to be flexible, to be compassionate, and ultimately to be just. Kia ora koutou.
Thank you very much, Professor Charter, and may I add my voice and join her in her last appeal to you. Let's work on this. Now I'd like to offer the floor to Dr. Miriam Wallet Aboubakrin, President of Tin Hinan Association.
Merci beaucoup à Monsieur le Président de la 77e Assemblée générale des Nations unies. Et je voudrais aussi joindre ma parole à ceux de mes prédécesseurs, dont Kenneth Deere, qui n'a cessé de nous rappeler et de rappeler aux Nations unies qui nous sommes, de rappeler que nous avons des façons de gouvernance, mais aussi des façons de nous identifier en tant que peuple, qui est importante à prendre en considération, et de nous rappeler l'histoire de la participation autochtone au sein des Nations unies. Je voudrais également remercier la docteure Claire Charter de nous avoir rappelé où nous nous sommes rendus dans le processus en fait de participation et les bénéfices qu'il y a eu dans ce processus jusque-là et comment est-ce que nous pourrions continuer à avancer ce processus. Merci beaucoup, Monsieur le Président, d'avoir lancé ce ton et d'avoir exprimé votre soutien à ce processus sans réserve. je pense que ça, c'est un grand atout pour nous aujourd'hui, spécialement à cette troisième audition qui est importante, qui marque la fin du processus initial lancé du document final de la conférence mondiale de 2014, mais qui marque, j'espère, et comme vous l'avez si bien mentionné, les débuts de la continuation du réel processus concret pour arriver à une participation effective des peuples autochtones au sein des Nations Unies. Je me permets maintenant de vous saluer toutes et tous, Tarlas, bonjour. Et je voudrais très brièvement aussi me présenter par qui je suis. Au-delà d'être la présidente de l'association Tininan, je suis aussi Weltamashak, donc je viens du peuple Touareg. Je suis de la région du Sahel, donc mon peuple se retrouve dans 5 pays, l'Algérie, le Burkina Faso, le Niger, la Libye, le Mali. Du fait de la colonisation et de la décolonisation, on a été répartis et disloqués dans ces 5 pays où nous retrouvons maintenant en tant que minorité. Alors, tout d'abord, je voudrais aussi remercier le bureau du président général pour avoir facilité ces auditions parce que, comme il l'avait mentionné, il y a eu beaucoup de flexibilité de leur part parce qu'il y avait la pandémie et on devait avoir ces auditions dans un contexte de pandémie et virtuel, ce qui n'allait pas justement dans le même sens d'une participation accrue des peuples autochtones parce qu'on allait se retrouver avec une participation très limitée des peuples autochtones et ils ont été flexibles à avoir ça maintenant. Je remercie également le secrétariat et l'instance permanente des Nations Unies sur les questions autochtones qui a été le pont entre nous et le bureau du président de l'Assemblée générale ainsi que le bureau de coordination, l'organe de coordination des peuples autochtones pour la participation qui a, malgré cette situation difficile, a quand même continué à garder ce sujet à la page des Nations Unies dans l'agenda. Je voudrais également à ce point vous remercier toutes et tous ici, délégation des États membres, qui nous avez soutenus, mais aussi vous qui êtes présents ici, qui voulez apprendre davantage sur ce processus et nos sœurs et frères autochtones de cette région socio-culturelle. Ce travail est important car les peuples autochtones contribuent grandement au travail des Nations Unies et le renforcement de notre participation sera avantageux pour l'Organisation des Nations Unies ainsi que pour tous les États membres. Les peuples autochtones ont été les ponts entre la terre-mère et toute l'humanité. Pendant des millénaires, nous avons reçu de la terre-mère des connaissances uniques qui sont vitales pour la survie de tous les êtres. La durabilité et comment vivre en symbiose, en harmonie avec les vivants et les non-vivants sur la terre. En outre, le rôle essentiel de nos connaissances traditionnelles dans la résolution des défis mondiaux tels que le changement climatique et la perte de la biodiversité, la prévention des conflits et la paix durable est indiscutable. Nous avons démontré notre leadership et notre résilience, ainsi que notre diplomatie au fil du temps. Comment pouvons-nous établir et promouvoir le dialogue interculturel, la compréhension mutuelle, le respect et la tolérance entre les différentes communautés si une partie de ces communautés sont absentes autour de la table? Comment aussi pouvons-nous construire des dialogues si les personnes sur lesquelles ces dialogues se tiennent sont absentes? C'est important que nous soyons là. En accueillant les perspectives uniques et la diversité culturelle des peuples autochtones à toutes les tables de discussion et de prise de décision des Nations Unies, les délibérations seront plus complètes et plus inclusives. Et j'entendais tantôt le président de l'Assemblée générale nous exprimer à quel point c'est important pour l'Organisation des Nations Unies et les États membres d'arriver à l'inclusion. Et c'est ce que nous offrons aujourd'hui sur la table. Nous savons que les processus décisionnels inclusifs conduisent à des meilleures politiques et à des solutions plus efficaces, plus équitables, plus durables et, comme ma sœur nous en appelait, plus justes aussi. Notre participation accrue favorisera des partenariats plus solides, mais également favorisera des partenariats plus solides, mais également elle aura pour avantage d'aider les agences des Nations Unies et les États membres à renforcer les capacités quant à la prise de décision éclairée. Outre ces avantages d'avoir des voix des peuples autochtones à tous les niveaux des discussions de prise de décision, nous voudrions rappeler que la participation significative des peuples autochtones à la prise de décision qui les concerne est à la base de notre autodétermination, qui est le fondement non seulement de la Charte des Nations Unies, mais également de la Déclaration universelle des droits de l'homme et de la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones. Ainsi, nous exhortons les États membres à reconnaître les avantages qu'apportera une participation accrue des peuples autochtones et à poursuivre ce processus avec vous. Ce processus sera guidé par la Déclaration des Nations Unies sur les droits des peuples autochtones, les documents finaux d'Alta et les documents finaux de la Conférence mondiale sur les peuples autochtones et doit reconnaître notre droit en tant que peuple. Et M. Kenneth Deere l'a bien rappelé au début, ce que veut dire vraiment adresser les Nations Unies en tant que peuple ou en tant qu'organisation non gouvernementale. Et cela fait partie intégrante de notre autodétermination. De plus, nous devons veiller à ce que l'accent reste mis sur les institutions représentatives des peuples autochtones plutôt que sur les organisations non gouvernementales en tant qu'entités qui représentent réellement les peuples autochtones dans le travail des Nations Unies. À l'avenir, nous appelons à la poursuite du processus vers la création des nouveaux statuts distincts pour les institutions représentatives des peuples autochtones, similaires à un statut d'observateur permanent, conformément au document final d'Alta, notamment le thème du paragraphe 10. Tout au long du processus, il est essentiel aussi d'assurer la participation pleine, effective, directe et significative des peuples autochtones à toutes les étapes et à tous les niveaux. Ces nouveaux statuts devraient être de haut niveau et refléter les droits des peuples autochtones à l'autodétermination et permettre leur pleine participation au processus et à la prise des décisions aux Nations Unies. Cette participation accrue est aussi un levier pour les Nations Unies d'assurer une cohérence entre les bonnes intentions exprimées et les actions concrètes. J'entends souvent, même aujourd'hui, le président de l'Assemblée générale l'a dit, et puis le secrétaire général des Nations Unies aussi l'a dit à l'ouverture de cette 22e session de l'instance permanente, nous ne voulons laisser personne de côté. Alors comment pouvons-nous assurer ne laisser personne de côté alors que plus de 500 millions de personnes sont laissées de côté quand les décisions réelles sont prises? Donc ça, c'est important, il faudrait y remédier et il faudrait y penser sous cet angle-là. Pour terminer, je voudrais réaffirmer que nous, peuples autochtones, sommes déterminés et puis vous le voyez, ça fait des décennies et des décennies et même un centenaire que nous sommes debout. Pour l'exemple que M. Deere a partagé avec nous, nous sommes déterminés et nous sommes de bonne foi avec tous les États membres, le bureau du président de l'Assemblée générale. Donc, nous voudrions continuer à travailler avec vous, les organisations, fonds et programmes des Nations unies pour accroître notre participation. Que vous en soyez conscients ou non, nous sommes vos meilleurs alliés pour affronter et trouver les solutions aux défis mondiaux auxquels l'humanité est confrontée. Je vous remercie.
Merci beaucoup, Madame Aboubakrin. I take it very close to my heart. I really regard you and all of you here as the allies for the 8 billion stakeholders of this organization. It took us to the conclusion of the panel discussion, but immediately we'll switch to the interactive dialogue. I should like to encourage participants to make their statements as concise as possible and not longer than 3 minutes for individual statements or 5 minutes for statements made on behalf of the group of states. To assist speakers in managing their time, a monitor in front of them will display the remaining speaking time. Participants with the longer statements are encouraged to read the shorter version of their text and submit their full-length statements to the Secretariat for posting on the journal. Nothing will be lost, I can promise you. Delegations speaking on behalf of groups are invited to approach the list of speakers table and will be given priority. One more technical announcement. I would like also to inform participants that those wishing to speak are kindly requested to press the button located at the base of the microphone in order to be placed on the list of speakers. Representatives of the Secretariat will walk around the room to ascertain the names of the participants wishing to speak. Once your name has been inscribed in the list, your microphone button will be deactivated as long as you don't get the floor. Thank you very much for your cooperation. Now I identify Australia taking the floor on behalf of the group of states.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. It is my pleasure to deliver this statement on behalf of the countries Argentina, Bolivia, Brazil, Canada, Denmark, Ecuador, El Salvador, Estonia, Finland, Guatemala, Mexico, New Zealand, Norway, Paraguay, Sweden, the United States, and as well as my own country, Australia. I'd like to reiterate our country's long-held position that a new status, separate from civil society organisations, must be developed to ensure Indigenous peoples can participate at the UN. Indigenous peoples have the right to participate and be heard in meetings of relevant United Nations bodies on issues affecting them. This position is in keeping with the outcome document of the 2014 World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, UN General Assembly Resolution 71/321, and with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This interactive hearings are an important avenue to move the discussions on possible measures necessary to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples forward. We welcome the opportunity to hear from Indigenous peoples in the room on what the next steps may look like. We look forward to the report of the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights following the November 2022 workshops on enhanced participation held in Geneva at the request of the Human Rights Council. We hope the conversations there will help to inform progress here in New York. One recommendation from the discussions in Geneva was to refer to accreditation criteria and accreditation mechanisms instead of selection criteria and selection mechanisms. Together, we propose a similar change in terminology in the General Assembly context. In so doing, we acknowledge that a future process will only determine who will participate in the United Nations rather than determine who is or who is not Indigenous. Our countries remain committed to ensuring the Indigenous peoples, wherever they live, are able to contribute to global decision-making in the UN through meaningful and inclusive participation. We look forward to continued efforts by Indigenous peoples and member states to advance this issue and are committed in doing our part in order to achieve this. As Dr. Wilton Littlechild has noted in past interactive hearings, Indigenous peoples have not come to the United Nations to create problems, but to create solutions. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you very much. Now I would like to offer the floor to the distinguished representative of the Indigenous Coordinating Body. Please raise your hand for the technicians to identify you. We have the distinguished representative in the 1 to 3rd row. Could he have the mic, please?
Thank you, Mr. President. I'm speaking on behalf of the Indigenous Coordinating Body, which was established in 2020 during the Quito Dialogue with 2 members from all 7 indigenous regions for consultation and coordination to facilitate cooperation among indigenous peoples with regard to the enhanced participation process. We take the floor for advocate for the continuation and strengthening of enhanced participation of indigenous peoples' representative institutions in the United Nations meetings on issues affecting them. As we firmly believe that such participation will bolster human rights and democracy, foster sustainable development, enrich cultural diversity, and promote peace and conflict resolution. In order to continue and successfully achieve this goal, we must uphold the fundamental principles enshrined in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the right to self-determination, the principle of participation in decision-making on every level, and the recognition of self-identification by indigenous peoples. The enhanced participation process should continue to be guided by the right of self-determination, the United Nations Declaration, the ALTA Outcome Document, the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples Outcome Document. Moreover, we must ensure that the focus remains on indigenous peoples' representative institutions rather than NGOs, as the entities representing indigenous peoples in the work of the UN. To further this case, we call for the continuation of the process towards establishment of a new and distinct status for indigenous peoples' representative institutions, at the minimum aiming to permanent observer status, in line with the ALTA Outcome Document, Theme 2, Paragraph 10. Throughout the entire process, it is essential to ensure the full and effective, direct and meaningful participation of indigenous peoples at every stage and level. This new status should be high level and reflect indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination and enable their full participation in the UN processes and decision-making. In conclusion, we are committed to enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples' representative institutions in relevant United Nations meetings on issues affecting them. We urge the General Assembly to join us in this commitment and invest in our collective financial resources, indigenous, social, ceremonial values, and other non-market values to ensure that the successful conclusion of this process. Kiitos. I thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you very much. Before giving the floor to the next speaker, if I may have a half a minute personal observation. With the distinguished representative of the Indigenous Peoples Organization, we have the common roots. His ancestors and my ancestors lived together thousands of years ago. Our origins are the same, and I hope our destinations will be the same. Thank you very much. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the European Union.
President, distinguished speakers, I have the pleasure of speaking on behalf of the European Union and its member states. The European Union welcomes this third informal interactive hearing with indigenous peoples on the important topic of enhanced participation for indigenous peoples. As an active participant in the consultations and negotiations on the participation of indigenous peoples in relevant UN meetings, the European Union is pleased to be part of this hearing, and we would like to thank the PGA for bringing us here together today to restart this important process that was interrupted by the pandemic. The latest discussion on this issue was the expert workshop on possible ways to enhance participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the Human Rights Council in November 2022. The negotiation process and previous consultations have allowed us to get a comprehensive picture and overview of the various realities with regard to indigenous peoples all over the world. The European Union is committed to support indigenous peoples by promoting their participation in relevant peace-building, human rights, and development processes that affect them, including those with the private sector. It is from that viewpoint that the European Union is engaging proactively in the consultations on enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples, representatives, and institutions in meetings of relevant United Nations bodies on issues affecting them, and that we supported the resulting resolution 71/321 during the 71st session. The European Union believes that this process will deepen the support for consensual and concrete outcomes for enhancing indigenous peoples' participation at the UN in view of the 78th session of the General Assembly, when negotiations on this very important topic will resume. We look forward to seeing active and engaged facilitators from both member states and indigenous peoples to steer the process. The European Union has a long-standing commitment to indigenous peoples' participation in decision-making. The EU Council conclusions of 2017 underscored the crucial importance of further enhancing opportunities for dialogue and consultation with indigenous peoples at all levels of EU cooperation, including in EU-funded programs and projects under all aid modalities, to secure their full and effective participation in order to obtain their free, prior, and informed consent in accordance with the UNDRIP in a meaningful and systematic way, and to inform and underpin EU external action policy and its implementation worldwide. The commitment to indigenous peoples' meaningful participation is contributing to the EU implementation of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the agenda's core principle of leaving no one behind. Allow me now to recapitulate the main elements in the EU approach on enhanced participation. When it comes to selection criteria, the EU has always advocated for a flexible approach due to the diversity of indigenous peoples in the world and their different ways of self-identifying and self-determining. This diversity of contexts and environments in which indigenous peoples live has to be taken into account. We also believe that the principles of Article 18 of the UNDRIP on the right to participation through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures should apply without discrimination of any kind. The selection process should be open and transparent, with some form of review mechanism being built into the final decision that are taken. On the issue of venues, the European Union can support participation by indigenous peoples' representative institutions in all General Assembly meetings, in meetings of its second and third committees, as well as in ECOSOC and the Human Rights Council meetings on issues affecting them. Participation modalities should include, within practical constraints, the opportunities to speak at relevant meetings and to provide written information relevant to those meetings. Additional modalities of participation in meetings of the General Assembly and its subsidiary bodies should be varied as determined appropriate by the chair of each meeting, who should take into account the nature of the matter at hand and the need to provide opportunities for indigenous peoples from all regions to effectively participate in decision-making affecting them. The European Union will remain engaged in this process with the objective of securing a consensual, clear, and concrete outcome. We hope that progress can be made on this important issue. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of the European Union for the very pragmatic, forward-looking proposals. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Assembly of First Nations, speaking on behalf of Nkai Narf.
Thank you, Mr. President. My name is Taylor Bain Takoza. I'm Dene from Northern Canada, and I'm honored to deliver this statement on behalf of the Assembly of First Nations, National Congress of American Indians, and the Native American Rights Fund. The best way to implement the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and safeguard our rights is for us, represented by our own representative institutions, to participate fully in the work of the UN with an appropriate status. Article 41 of the Declaration provides in part that ways and means of ensuring participation of Indigenous peoples on issues affecting us shall be established. The inherent rights in the Declaration provide important underpinning for an appropriate status. To name just a few, Article 2 of the Declaration provides that Indigenous peoples are free and equal to all other peoples. Article 3 of the Declaration provides that Indigenous peoples have the right to self-determination. Article 18 recognizes our right to participate in decision-making in matters which would affect our rights through representatives chosen by ourselves in accordance with our own procedures. Because matters affecting us may occur in any of the UN venues, we require full and effective participation in all venues, and we must be the ones determining whether something affects us. Based on the foregoing, and as set forth in the ALTA outcome document, we call for, at a minimum, permanent observer status within the UN system, enabling our direct participation through our own governments and parliaments, which include inter alia, our traditional councils and authorities. The outcome document of the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples recognized the benefit to the world of Indigenous participation, specifically highlighting our significant contributions to the promotion of sustainable development, to a just balance among the economic, social, and environmental needs of present and future generations, to promoting harmony with nature to protect our planet and ecosystems, to climate change, mitigation, and adaptation, to knowledge acquired through experience in hunting, gathering, fishing, and agriculture, as well as our sciences, technologies, and cultures. This is just to name a few areas benefiting the whole world from Indigenous participation. All formal and informal consultations and negotiations concerning our enhanced participation must be conducted in an open, inclusive, and transparent manner at every stage. We also request that states provide financial support for Indigenous participation and related activities. We urge you, the President of the General Assembly, to ensure that work on this issue is continued in the General Assembly. The work of achieving permanent observer status for Indigenous peoples is not finished, and the work cannot end at this session. We ask that the General Assembly renew its efforts on this matter and to recommend state support for a strong resolution from the Human Rights Council in their parallel consideration of this issue. Thank you, Mr. President.
I thank the distinguished representative of the Assembly of First Nation, and I hear you. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Colombia, the permanent representative of Colombia.
Señor Presidente, muchas gracias por convocar esta tercera audiencia informal en la que es urgente concretar resultados que nos acerquen al mejoramiento real de la participación de los pueblos indígenas en las Naciones Unidas. Hablo en mi calidad de mujer indígena, de vocera del Gobierno de Colombia y del presidente Gustavo Petro. Desafortunadamente, nuestra participación siempre se ha dado bajo el supuesto equivocado de que los pueblos indígenas somos lo mismo que la sociedad civil. Los pueblos indígenas somos sujetos colectivos de derechos, con formas de ser distintas y diferenciadas de las sociedades mayoritarias, y en la defensa de nuestros derechos, nuestras culturas y nuestras tierras. Por esta razón, Colombia apoya firmemente la creación de un nuevo estatus diferente al de las organizaciones de la sociedad civil que pueda garantizar la participación plena, efectiva y significativa de los pueblos indígenas al interior de las Naciones Unidas. Señor presidente, evito decir en las cuestiones que nos afectan porque parto del hecho de que todos los ámbitos temáticos de la agenda mundial afectan a los pueblos indígenas y que podemos realizar aportes valiosos en relación con todos estos asuntos. Mi país considera que deben establecerse espacios específicos para las instituciones representativas de los pueblos indígenas, acreditadas ante la Asamblea General y sus órganos subsidiarios, el Consejo Económico y Social y sus órganos subsidiarios, el Consejo de Derechos Humanos y sus órganos subsidiarios, así como en otras conferencias, cumbres y reuniones convocadas por Naciones Unidas. Por esta razón, pensamos que las discusiones deben centrarse en la definición de criterios y mecanismos de acreditación, con miras a garantizar que el nuevo estatus propuesto para los pueblos indígenas sea una realidad. Por último, señor presidente, necesitamos aprovechar el impulso logrado en estas audiencias interactivas. Por esto lo aliento a usted y a todos los aquí presentes a considerar el establecimiento de un mecanismo de seguimiento y evaluación del valioso trabajo adelantado con el fin de seguir avanzando en el objetivo de mejorar la participación de los pueblos indígenas en Naciones Unidas. Muchas gracias.
Thank you very much, Madam Ambassador. Now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of the Inuit Circumpolar Council.
Qoyanak, Presidenti, qoyanarlu maani naalangaaffiit nayuuttut, inuyaallu nalu nayuuttut. Thank you, Mr. President. Thank you to the states in the room and also all the peoples in the room. From the Inuit Circumpolar Council, we support the intervention by the Indigenous Coordinating Body, and we have these following comments to add. For us, it is important that we in this room are very aware of this not being about one people. This is about all indigenous peoples who have stood together throughout decades, building the rocks, building the foundation that we are now standing upon. The consolidated foundation, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, which affirms our right of self-determination, an inherent right that we came into the negotiations with to the UN in the 70s and 80s when that negotiation started. Our people, the Inuit people, we live across 4 very, very different nation states: Greenland, Canada, Alaska, and Chukotka, Russia. In 1977, we came together, and as it was said by the founding father of our organization, Mr. Eben Hobson Sr., we were not a nation state, but we constitute a nation. And today we are here in the United Nations, having had ECOSOC consultative status as an NGO for 40 years, since 1983. And for the future generation of our people to be able to come into this room and speak on their own behalf through their own governments and representative institutions has to be the next step. So we call on all states to commit to continuing this process of enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples. This is a fundamental principle of democracy, that we can speak on our own behalf, that we can bring forward whatever policies and messages we have to the world and participate fully at all venues of the UN. This is not only about the venues that are called something about indigenous. This is about all of the venues. anything that goes on here affects indigenous peoples from all around the world. So we welcome the statements from the group of states who also reiterated the necessity of maintaining the focus on those consolidated principles that are in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, including the right of self-identification. We are the ones to decide who to represent us through our own representative institutions. In conclusion, I would like to call on all states to continue funding and financial support for all indigenous peoples to be part of this process. Again, this is not about one or a few of the peoples of the world. This is about all of the peoples of the world, and we need to make sure that everybody are able to attend and participate in the preparatory meetings and at the UN meetings for us to stand united in our endeavors for this new special and new category of the UN. That is how we achieved the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, and that is how we will continue to stand together in achieving the endeavors of enhanced participation through our own representative institutions. I am confident that we will bring knowledge, expertise, and additional worldviews for better results of everyone in the UN, better results for all peoples of the world. And I look forward to that future of us contributing directly through our own representative institutions in all negotiations that go on in these rooms that we are in now. Qoyanak, thank you to everyone.
I thank the distinguished representative of Inuit Circumpolar Council for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Denmark.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. The Kingdom of Denmark wishes to highlight the importance of delivering on the commitments made by all member states at the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in September 2014 to enable the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in meetings on all issues affecting them. We can all agree that the process has been moving disappointingly slow. Now that we're finally resuming the process, we would like to thank the President of the General Assembly for arranging this dialogue in the margins of the Permanent Forum, hoping that we can ensure a broad, inclusive, and geographically balanced participation of Indigenous peoples in this meeting. It is the principled opinion of the Kingdom of Denmark that the matter should be addressed by the General Assembly, as it needs to be implemented across the entire UN system in order to fully conform with the rights set out in UNDRIP. However, we would also like to thank the MRIP for taking the word forward to promote the participation of Indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in the work of the Human Rights Council. Let me end by reiterating the Kingdom of Denmark's unwavering support for Indigenous peoples' right to participate in the work of the entire UN system. Participation in international decision-making processes is a crucial element in the implementation of Indigenous peoples' right to self-determination. Further, enhancing the participation of Indigenous peoples should be viewed as an asset to enrich and enhance the decision-making capacity of the UN system, contributing not only to the well-being of us all, but for human rights for all. I thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Denmark for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Global Indigenous Youth Caucus.
Aloha nui kako. I am Makanalani Gomes, speaking on behalf of the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus as one of its 3 co-chairs. The GIYC was officially established in 2006 and recognized by the UN Permanent Forum and is composed of Indigenous young people from all 7 Indigenous regions. The Global Indigenous Youth Caucus affirms we are fully aligned with the continuation of this process to strengthen and enhance Indigenous peoples' representative institutions in the UN process. We underline the importance of this process continuing with the full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples. As Indigenous youth, we grow up with a deep respect for our ways of life, including our political systems, and have a firm understanding that we come from nations with sovereign governing systems that have existed for millennia. It is time that the UN aligns itself with that reality as well. Thus, we as Indigenous young people from the 7 regions ask the General Assembly to apply the principles upholding Indigenous self-determination in the UN Declaration, such as Article 18 within its processes. We join the call of Chief Tashika Ratana, our elders and Indigenous coordinating body, for the establishment of a status for Indigenous peoples' representative institutions on equal footing to other governments in line with the Alta Outcome Document, Theme 2, Paragraph 10. And we welcome the proposal of Brazil to host the World Conference Plus 10 and ask the General Assembly to welcome this proposal. Mahalo nui for your time, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Global Indigenous Youth Caucus for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Mexico.
México agradece al presidente de la Asamblea General por la organización de este tercer diálogo informal. Es innegable que los órganos competentes de Naciones Unidas discuten asuntos que conciernen a los pueblos indígenas, por lo que su participación es esencial para avanzar en el respeto, protección, promoción y garantía de sus derechos. En Ginebra, México y Guatemala promovimos la organización del taller que ha sido citado esta tarde, celebrado en noviembre, precisamente sobre formas para mejorar la participación de pueblos indígenas en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos, del cual emanaron importantes reflexiones. Señor presidente, la voz que se debe de escuchar hoy sobre este tema tan importante es la voz de los pueblos indígenas, por lo que seré breve en destacar 5 puntos generales que deben considerarse en todo proceso para aumentar su participación. Primero, la Declaración de la ONU sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas es el punto de partida y el piso mínimo. Contiene las normas mínimas para la dignidad y el bienestar de los pueblos indígenas. Ninguna medida puede estar por debajo de la declaración. La declaración, en su integridad, es la base sobre la cual construimos. La participación de los pueblos indígenas es esencial para alcanzar los fines de la declaración. Segundo, los pueblos indígenas no son organizaciones no gubernamentales. Los pueblos indígenas tienen gobiernos y tienen control de sus territorios en el ejercicio de su derecho a la libre determinación. Gracias. Los pueblos indígenas no deben acreditarse como ONGs o a través de estas. Es necesario que los pueblos indígenas puedan participar bajo un estatus propio. El actual gobierno de México se caracteriza por mantener un diálogo de gobierno a gobierno en pie de igualdad. Tercero, las modalidades de participación de los pueblos indígenas no pueden ser inferiores a las modalidades de participación de las ONG con carácter consultivo de COSOC. Cuarto, toda medida que aumente la participación de los pueblos indígenas debe asegurar una participación geográfica equitativa. Asegurar la participación geográfica equitativa implica reconocer que algunas regiones del mundo tienen mayor población indígena y que algunas regiones podrían tener menos recursos para asegurar una participación efectiva. Y quinto, para México, la participación efectiva de los pueblos indígenas debe ser inclusiva e incidir en el empoderamiento de mujeres, jóvenes, adultos mayores y personas con discapacidad indígenas. Por ello, su participación en el trabajo y las actividades de los órganos de Naciones Unidas es particularmente importante. Para concluir, señor presidente, consideramos que estos 5 puntos deben de servir de base, de partida para examinar medidas para aumentar la participación de los pueblos indígenas conforme al documento final de la Conferencia Mundial sobre los Pueblos Indígenas. México está convencido de que la participación de los pueblos indígenas fortalece el trabajo de la ONU y que el sistema de Naciones Unidas cuenta con la suficiente capacidad de innovación para tal fin. Consideramos que las ideas y reflexiones de este diálogo de esta tarde serán de mucha utilidad para seguir identificando pasos concretos hacia adelante. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Mexico for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Navajo Nation Human Rights.
Since the Navajo Nation is taking the floor for the first time in this session, we express our thanks to the President for being open to the dialogue and also the positive comments made by member states. The Navajo Nation has been advocating in international human rights organizations for many years. The nation participated in the negotiation of the United Nations and OAS Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and participated in the 2014 Alta, Norway Indigenous meeting by supporting the outcome document. The Navajo Nation in particular is supportive of the outcome document theme 2, recommendation 10. Indigenous governments' participation in the United Nations system, including the General Assembly. The Navajo Nation has long sought to participate in the UN sessions. Unfortunately, the Navajo Nation cannot be accredited based on its own status as an indigenous government to participate in the UN meetings. It has to seek other NGOs' credentials to enter the meetings. The Navajo Nation is a sovereign government answerable to its constituents like member nation states in this forum. UNDRIP clearly recognizes the indigenous peoples have their own government systems. Since time immemorial, as sovereign governments, indigenous nations must be recognized as state governmental entities, much the same as member states. The Navajo Nation supported the minimum standard of permanent observer status. To dismiss the full participation of indigenous nations is contrary to the mission of the United Nations and the numerous declarations, conventions, and other human rights mechanisms that set human rights standards above all civil and political platforms. The world pandemic interrupted the daily lives of all peoples and in many instances placed governments in dire straits. Indigenous governments were not unscathed. The 2023 UNFII session is the first time since the pandemic that an in-person meeting is held again. Keeping this in mind, it is important that the nation states provide financial support to the continuation of the Indigenous Coordinating Body in order to enhance Indigenous government participation. In addition, the Navajo Nation supports the need to extend further review of the Indigenous peoples' participation by exercising flexibility and adapting to the changing needs of Indigenous peoples and their government post the pandemic. The Navajo Nation further supports that there be regional meetings where Indigenous governments have the opportunity to provide recommendations. Overall, one of the purposes of Indigenous government participation in the UN systems and General Assembly is to enhance their participation and their work of the General Assembly. Exercising inclusion, flexibility, and transparency provides Indigenous governments participation in the UN system. We need to build on the 2014 outcome document. The global agenda affects Indigenous peoples and their governments. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Navajo Nation Human Rights for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Finland.
Chair, we thank the President of the General Assembly for organizing this third informal hearing on the issue of enhanced participation. I would like to begin by expressing Finland's long-term support to promoting the rights of indigenous peoples, including their right to participate meaningfully. Therefore, we warmly welcome this important event in the margins of the Permanent Forum today. We are looking forward to hearing views on how participation of indigenous peoples can be enhanced at the UN. Through the UN Declaration, the rights of indigenous peoples, through the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, states committed to establish means of ensuring participation of indigenous peoples on issues affecting them. Now it is time to move ahead in a more comprehensive manner. We welcome the expert workshop on possible ways to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the Human Rights Council, organized last November, as an important step in this regard. We are very pleased also to witness enhanced participation in some UN issues, such as climate change, food security, and biodiversity. These are great examples on how common challenges can be best solved together with indigenous peoples who have expertise and solutions to issues that concern them. Those issues extend to areas of peace and security, development issues, and human rights across the three pillars of the UN. Finland's position is well known to fully include indigenous peoples in all decision-making processes that concern their rights. Full, equal, effective, and meaningful participation of indigenous women and girls in all their diversity must be ensured in this process. Finland works towards indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions having the possibility to independently participate, make statements, and written submissions at the UN. The UN is truly inclusive and can give informed policy guidance only when it opens its doors to these voices. This is important when indigenous peoples themselves judge the matter to affect their interest, but especially when the UN directly addresses indigenous peoples' rights. Chair, we are now moving towards a new round of intergovernmental negotiations, and this process will give us a great opportunity to walk the talk and take concrete steps to enhance participation. We are confident that facilitators from both member states and indigenous peoples can steer the process so that we can move ahead and open doors to indigenous peoples at the UN. To sum up, we consider it imperative to continue consultations and discussions on the participation of indigenous peoples at the UN. Only this way we can live up to the commitment made in the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples in 2014. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Finland for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished Special Rapporteur on the rights of the indigenous people.
Thank you very much, Mr. President. I just wanted to start by congratulating my brothers and sisters for the work that they have done so far in the indigenous coordinating the body to advance the implementation of our right to self-determination by advocating for full and equal participation of indigenous peoples in the United Nations system. After several years of work by this body, the General Assembly and the entire UN system must act on your recommendations without any further delay. The right of indigenous peoples to participate in decision-making in matters which will affect their rights through representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures must be respected, including at the UN level. Therefore, I call upon all those states that have not yet expressed their support for a full indigenous participation before UN bodies to do so without any further delay. As you know, Article 44 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples established that the organs and specialized agencies of the United Nations system shall contribute to the full realization of the provisions of these declarations. In particular, this article states that ways and means of ensuring participation of indigenous peoples on issues affecting them shall be established. The Human Rights Committee, in its General Recommendation 25 on Article 25 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, recognized that the right to take part in the conduct of public affairs also covers the formulation and implementation of policy at the international and regional levels. To give effect to the fundamental principles reflected in Article 41 of the UN Declaration and Article 25 of the ICCPR, it is essential that indigenous peoples can fully and effectively participate with a distinctive status before the UN system. So I urge UN agencies along with the states to move on with the process to achieve this distinctive status for indigenous people and provide sufficient funding and support to make it possible. As the Secretary General stated in his call to action, human diversity is an asset, not a threat. We must appreciate the richness of our differences while never losing sight of our common humanity and dignity. Every community, including indigenous peoples, must feel that its identity is respected and that it can fully participate in society as a whole. Enhancing the participation of indigenous peoples in the work of the UN system shall be viewed as an asset to enrich its decision-making capacity and better implementation of the mandate of the UN bodies. Mr. President, let me conclude my statement by reminding the member states that indigenous people should be free to participate in UN international meetings without persecution, without taking photographs or intimidation in participating in international meetings like the Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues as representatives or exercising the right to participate. Thank you very much, Mr. President.
I thank the Special Rapporteur on Rights of the Indigenous People for his statement, and I now give the floor to the representative of Sami parliaments in Finland, Norway, and Sweden.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm speaking in my capacity as the President of the Sami Parliament in Sweden. I deliver this statement on behalf of the Sami Parliament in Finland, Sweden and Norway, and the Sami Council. We fully support the process of enhancing participation of indigenous peoples in United Nations, and we support the statement delivered by the International Coordination Body. We call for an intergovernmental negotiation process under the General Assembly that would take into account full and effective participation of indigenous peoples. We recommend that the President of the General Assembly appoints for advisors 2 nominated by the Member States and 2 nominated by the indigenous peoples to assist him in carrying out consultation of the procedures of intergovernmental negotiation process. The outcome of the negotiation process would be a draft modalities for the process on enhancing indigenous peoples' participation in the work of United Nations. This consultation roadmap could include several measures and modalities and should cover the following years. Alternatively, we could also accept a resolution of the Third Committee on the consultation roadmap encouraging the President of the General Assembly to nominate the advisors. Moreover, we would like to remind the importance of holding the regional consultations on the matter as requested in the 2017 General Assembly resolution. All of these consultations have not been concluded yet. We are of the view that a new category should be created for the indigenous peoples, allowing for the indigenous peoples' self-government institutions to participate in the work of the United Nations independently through the representatives chosen by themselves in accordance with their own procedures. Indigenous peoples' self-government institutions, including the Sami Parliament of Finland, Norway, and Sweden, are currently prevented from independently participating in the work of the United Nations beyond the annual sessions of Permanent Forum on the Indigenous Issues and the expert mechanism on the right of indigenous peoples. The existing UN rules for participation of non-state entities prevent indigenous people, self-government institutions to independently take part in the work of the United Nations beyond the mentioned UN bodies. In our view, it is crucial importance that indigenous people's self-government institutions are allowed to take part in the work of the United Nations. This will also strengthen the United Nations' ability to effectively address and resolve issues affecting indigenous peoples. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Sami parliaments in Finland, Norway, and Sweden for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Norway.
Thank you, Mr. President, and let me also thank the panelists for setting the stage in a very informative manner for today's discussion. Let me express how pleased we are to participate in this third hearing, aiming to follow up a key recommendation made 10 years ago in the Alta Conference and in the outcome document from the World Conference on the Indigenous Peoples in 2014, all with the goal to ensure greater participation from indigenous peoples in United Nations bodies on issues affecting them. And as many have said, this is very, very much in line with the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And I think also, as many have mentioned, it is worth noting that the outcome document was adopted by consensus in the General Assembly, which shows a broad support among UN member states to promote and protect the rights of indigenous peoples and also to follow up on the proposals in the outcome document. Norway has on several occasions expressed its support for greater participation of indigenous peoples' representatives and institutions in the UN, participation with their own distinctive status. It will contribute to building a common understanding at the UN on the challenges that indigenous peoples face. And in addition, and this has been mentioned very eloquently by many, it will promote the resources, the experiences and solutions that the ancestral knowledge of indigenous peoples can offer. Increased participation by indigenous peoples will, in our view, bring added legitimacy and sustainability to the decisions adopted by the United Nations. Norway was pleased to co-chair an expert meeting in Geneva in November last year, and this has been mentioned by many. The focus of the expert meeting was to enhance indigenous participation in the work of the Human Rights Council, and the agenda of that meeting was practical, focusing on clarifying the modalities for indigenous participation and finding a practical way forward. The discussions were indeed constructive, and we believe there is need for a concrete and targeted process under the Human Rights Council to follow up this process. We also hope that progress achieved in Geneva can inform the process in New York in order to ensure a system-wide approach. And as this is an interactive dialogue, I also wanted to react a bit on proposals that have been made. And moving forward, I must say that I very much appreciate the appeal by Professor Claire Charters, and also seconded by the Sami parliaments of Finland, Norway, and Sweden, to agree on a roadmap for a resolution, and also to apply the principles that Professor Charters mentioned, the principles including of generosity, inclusivity, transparency, collaboration, and integrity moving forward. And we need to move forward urgently. It has gone 10 years since the Alta document, and Norway would be very eager to find a way forward very quickly. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Norway for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Expert Mechanism on the Rights of the Indigenous People.
Thank you, distinguished President of the General Assembly, esteemed delegates, and honorable indigenous peoples representative. As the chair of Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, I take the floor to offer our expertise and assistance in the ongoing process of enhancing indigenous peoples' participation at the General Assembly level. I thank the work of the indigenous coordinating body on this process. Mr. President, Articles 5 and 18 of the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples explicitly define indigenous peoples' right to participation in decision-making on matters that related to them, including the overarching right to self-determination as expressed in Articles 3 and 4 of the Declaration. The Declaration, along with the United Nations, has the obligation to promote the United Nations declarations inside as well as outside of the United Nations. Article 41 of the Declaration specifically addresses the role of the United Nations in the full realization of its provisions, including by establishing ways and means of ensuring the participation of indigenous peoples on issues affecting them in the United Nations. The expert mechanisms report on self-determination, in which it's highlighted that the participation of indigenous peoples internationally, including the expression of indigenous peoples' worldviews, lived experience and perspectives at the United Nations, is an example of the exercise of their self-determinations and their right to determine their space in the international community based upon the right to equality. Self-determination may also include indigenous people's right to determine their place in the international community based upon the principles of equal rights. From an indigenous perspective, participation by indigenous peoples in the international indigenous movement is an example of the exercise of self-determination. That includes expression of indigenous peoples at the United Nations and other international forums where they can express their worldviews and perspectives on the international level, external to their own communities. The importance of ensuring that indigenous peoples' voices, the very people whose self-determination is affirmed by the declarations, are heard in the international community through participation in international policy forums and decision-making bodies is recognized. Mr. President, we emphasize the importance of the 2020 Kyoto and 2016 Bangkok outcome documents as the basis for continued discussions on enhanced participation and acknowledge the OHCHR November workshop as a valuable model for cooperation and dialogue. MRIP is committed to promoting indigenous people's rights and well-being, and we urge all parties to work collaboratively, respecting the rights of indigenous peoples and strain into the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Thank you, and we remain available for the assistance of the member states as well as indigenous peoples in this process, and invite you to participate in the upcoming session of the expert mechanism in this July, where enhanced participation will be an agenda item. I thank you.
I thank the chair of the expert mechanism on the rights of the indigenous people for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Assembly of First Nations.
They spoke already.
Oh.
Then now I'll give the floor to the distinguished representative of Guatemala.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Guatemala se congratula por la realización de este diálogo, el cual consideramos es parte de un proceso que debería resultar en acciones concretas, tales como definir un nuevo estatus que permita a los pueblos indígenas participar, distinguiéndolos de las instituciones de sociedad civil, instituciones nacionales de derechos humanos, organizaciones no gubernamentales o comunidades locales. Otorgar una mayor participación a las organizaciones e instituciones indígenas en asuntos que les conciernen y dar solución a cuestiones que obstaculizan la participación de los pueblos indígenas, como el acceso a Internet, barreras lingüísticas y precariedad de financiamiento. Estas acciones serían un aporte esencial a todo el sistema de Naciones Unidas. Asimismo, consideramos que este proceso debe seguir garantizando la participación plena y efectiva de pueblos indígenas en todas las etapas y niveles. Con relación a los criterios de acreditación, Guatemala considera que el derecho a la libre determinación y la autoidentificación es primordial y debe ser respetado. Entendemos que la autoidentificación no puede ser el único criterio. No obstante, debe existir flexibilidad en los criterios de acreditación, particularmente debido a la amplia variedad de pueblos indígenas que existen en el mundo. Guatemala es un país multilingüe, pluricultural y multiétnico que reconoce la existencia de los pueblos mestizo, garífuna, xinca y maya. De acuerdo con el último censo, el 43.8% de la población guatemalteca se autoidentifica como indígena. Sin embargo, conscientes de los desafíos en la implementación de los derechos de los pueblos indígenas en el mundo, consideramos que el reconocimiento por parte de los estados no debe ser un requisito. Las voces de los pueblos indígenas deben ser escuchadas para definir los criterios de acreditación, y mis predecesores han sido claros en su mensaje y en los criterios que consideran que deben de tomarse en cuenta. Con relación a los mecanismos de acreditación, consideramos necesario el establecimiento de un nuevo mecanismo que acredita a las instituciones representativas de los pueblos indígenas para formar parte de una nueva categoría de participación. El nuevo mecanismo podría estar integrado por representantes de pueblos indígenas de las 7 regiones socioculturales indígenas. Por otro lado, Guatemala considera que cualquier decisión que se tome sobre la materia no debería interferir en las modalidades de participación ya existentes en el Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas ni en el Mecanismo de Expertos de Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, MREP. Sin embargo, las buenas prácticas ejercidas en dichas instancias deben ser tomadas en cuenta, al igual que los resultados y recomendaciones de los talleres celebrados en Ginebra el pasado noviembre y que han sido referidos. Para construir un futuro más equitativo y sostenible, es indispensable amplificar las voces de todos, incluyendo los pueblos indígenas. Guatemala continuará promoviendo la implementación de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas e impulsando iniciativas que fortalezcan su participación en los asuntos que les conciernen. Guatemala reitera su compromiso de impulsar medidas para que los derechos de los pueblos indígenas sean reconocidos universalmente. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Guatemala for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indian Law Resource Center.
Thank you to the Presidency of the General Assembly for organizing this, and thank you to Mr. Chair. The Indian Law Resource Center has been working to advance Indigenous peoples' rights through the UN and the Organization of American States since we were established in 1978. And we've worked to secure the right of Indigenous peoples' representative institutions to participate and contribute to the work of the UN on their own behalf since this conversation began with the preparatory process for the 2014 World Conference. Over these many years of hearings and negotiations, the Center's position has been clear. Indigenous peoples' representative institutions are not non-governmental organizations. They establish and enforce our laws, They regulate our lands and actions. They administer social service programs. They are our government. Indigenous peoples' representative institutions have expertise and interest in nearly every aspect of work done at the UN. Human rights and biodiversity, of course, but also migration, climate, women's rights, sustainable development, peace, and security. Indigenous peoples have much to offer to these policy debates, and we have much at stake in these decisions on these topics. Our representative institutions must be able to attend meetings that are relevant to them, speak on their own behalf, and participate in decision-making on matters affecting our rights. This will require a new status, distinct from existing provisions for NGOs, to reflect what Indigenous peoples' representative institutions in fact are and what they in fact do. The new status must be consistent with the UN Declaration as adopted by the General Assembly in 2007. The Declaration says in Article 43 that it constitutes the minimum standards for survival, dignity, and well-being of Indigenous peoples. And in 2014, the General Assembly in the World Conference Outcome Document reaffirmed its solemn commitment to respect, promote, and advance, and in no way diminish the rights of Indigenous peoples. In this discussion about enhanced participation, we draw attention specifically to Indigenous peoples' rights to self-determination, which includes self-government rights, rights of participation in decision-making through their own representatives, and right to determine their own identity or membership in accordance with their customs and traditions. The compilation of views is an important starting point as the UN moves now to finish the work of the World Conference. The compilation reflects the thoughtful and careful result of discussions and deliberations between Indigenous peoples, member states, and the advisors appointed to lead that process. And most importantly, it reflects work done with attention and respect for the UN Declaration. After a decade of study, reports, and informal hearings, it's time to apply the standards of the UN Declaration to the UN's work. We call for a clear and orderly process that allows for full and effective participation of Indigenous peoples in resolving any outstanding points. A process that will end with a resolution to finally recognize Indigenous peoples' representative institutions' inherent authority to speak for themselves. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indian Law Resource Center for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of plurinational state of Bolivia.
Muchas gracias, mi hermano presidente. Yampaspi Cachun Hatunapaico y Tucuy Cancunapa, a nombre del Consejo de Ayllus y Marcas del Collasuyo Conamá, en esta oportunidad tengo el honor de dirigirme a nombre de mi país, Estado Plurinacional de Bolivia. Valoramos profundamente este diálogo abierto entre los Estados miembros de la ONU y los pueblos indígenas. Creemos que ha llegado el momento de que nuestras voces se escuchen. Escucharnos no solo es traer el beneficio al sistema multilateral, sino también posibilidades de colaboración y solidaridad entre los pueblos indígenas de las 7 regiones socioculturales. Han pasado 9 años desde la Conferencia Mundial sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, en la que los estados se comprometieron, cito, nos comprometemos a examinar la forma de hacer posible la participación de representantes e instituciones de los pueblos indígenas en las reuniones de los órganos pertinentes de las Naciones Unidas sobre los asuntos que los conciernen. A pesar del tiempo que ha transcurrido, observamos que la organización aún no ha logrado la participación regular y permanente de los pueblos indígenas en los asuntos que nos conciernen. Consecuentemente, consideramos que los pueblos indígenas debemos tener la categoría de observador a la luz de los principios de la autodeterminación y autoidentificación, de modo que podamos hablar por nosotros mismos en esta organización. Los pueblos indígenas tenemos organizaciones y sistemas legales que son mucho más antiguos que todo el sistema de las Naciones Unidas. Por tanto, permitir nuestra participación únicamente como ONGs es desconocernos y limitar nuestra libre autodeterminación ancestralmente y milenariamente desde nuestros pueblos indígenas originarios. Finalmente, mi hermano presidente, los pueblos del mundo, como menciona la Carta de la ONU, hemos depositado toda nuestra fe en esta organización y en coherencia con sus principios, los pueblos indígenas del mundo no estamos solicitando un favor, esperamos pacientemente por la corrección de una injusticia y que viva la unidad de nuestros pueblos del mundo. Muchas gracias, mi hermano presidente, y un hayaya.
I thank the distinguished representative of plurinational state of Bolivia for his statement. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Gobierno Territorial Autónomo de la Nación Wampish. Can you raise your hand for some time? Yeah.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mi nombre es Nayab Santiago, vengo desde el nororiente de la Amazonía peruana. Voy a hablar en nombre del Gobierno Territorial Autónomo de la Nación Wampish, un pueblo que, en base a la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas y el Convenio 169, nos autoproclamamos como un gobierno indígena en ejercicio de esos derechos con el objetivo de construir y reivindicar nuestros derechos milenarios. Después de largas luchas y trabajos, el 2021, la ONU confirmó la inclusión del territorio de la Nación Wampish en el registro de territorios y áreas conservadas locales, TICA, del Centro Mundial para el Seguimiento de la Conservación, así como en la Base Mundial de Datos sobre Áreas Protegidas. Esto ha sido nuestro primer paso para asegurar la continuidad de nuestros territorios para las generaciones futuras, la humanidad y el planeta, y nos comprometimos a seguir trabajando de forma efectiva y equitativa. Nuestro territorio integral es de 1.327.760 hectáreas de bosques y fuentes de agua en la Amazonía. Parte de ello incluye la cordillera de Campanquias, una área de suma importancia al ser un foco mundial de diversidad biológica con alta composición de especies endémicas. En efecto, solo el territorio Wampish captura 57 millones de toneladas cada año de dióxido de carbono y almacena 522 millones de toneladas de dióxido de carbono, muy superior a la meta del NDC Perú 2023. Pese a ello, el territorio Wampish está expuesto a constantes amenazas, siendo nosotros los conservadores y protegemos la vida del sistema planetario. Señor presidente, la actual legislación peruana sobre la titulación de territorios de los pueblos indígenas se realiza por comunidades y no por integridad territorial ancestral, permitiendo que los pueblos indígenas posean territorios fragmentados. Esta figura jurídica también impide el pleno ejercicio del derecho de libre determinación y autogobierno consagrados en los instrumentos internacionales. Con estos antecedentes, recomendamos al Estado peruano que apruebe una ley específica que permita la titulación de territorio integral y no territorios fragmentados. 2. Que el Estado peruano desista de la categorización de la cordillera de Campanquias como área de conservación y protegida por parte del Estado peruano. Para finalizar, señor presidente, quiero compartir, hermanos y hermanas, este mensaje. El planeta es nuestra casa, necesita nuestra ayuda el tiempo se está agotando. Es momento de pensar un poco más en nuestro futuro que en el presente. El planeta es nuestra casa. Por favor, cuidémoslo.
I thank the distinguished representative of Gobierno Territorial Autónomo de la Nancia Wampis for his statement. And I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ecuador.
Señor presidente, agradezco la organización de este espacio que nos permite reflexionar sobre las necesidades, retos y desafíos en la participación de los pueblos indígenas en Naciones Unidas, en el marco de la crisis que a nivel global estamos enfrentando. Mi delegación considera pertinente iniciar el camino hacia el reconocimiento de una categoría específica en Naciones Unidas que facilite y promueve una mayor participación de los pueblos indígenas en las discusiones sobre las situaciones que nos afectan, con el objetivo principal de no quedarnos atrás. Ecuador y Bolivia facilitan desde hace varios años la resolución sobre los derechos de los pueblos indígenas. En ella se promueve, entre otras cosas, la importancia y urgencia de implementar mecanismos y estrategias para promover una mayor participación de los pueblos indígenas, antes, durante y después de la celebración de los foros permanentes sobre las cuestiones indígenas y en cada oportunidad en que los temas de relevancia para nosotros sean abordados. Temas como las brechas que mantienen a los pueblos indígenas al margen del desarrollo. En este sentido me quiero referir a la situación de los pueblos indígenas en el mundo digital y tecnológico. El avance del mundo digital, la inteligencia artificial, el acceso al Big Data, sin lugar a duda genera nuevas y poderosas oportunidades de desarrollo para la sociedad, pero también tiene el potencial de profundizar las brechas de desigualdad existentes. Quienes tienen acceso a estas herramientas pueden posicionarse rápidamente dentro de las nuevas reglas del mercado y la globalización, y quienes no quedan en desventaja. Este es el caso de los pueblos indígenas. Por ejemplo, en Latinoamérica tienen menos de la mitad de acceso a celulares que sus pares no indígenas. El acceso a una computadora es ampliamente menor, lo que implica una evidente exclusión digital. No obstante, cuando las tecnologías son accesibles para los pueblos indígenas y se complementan con su conocimiento tradicional, constituyen una herramienta poderosa para avanzar en el desarrollo social, económico, ambiental y con identidad de los pueblos indígenas de la región. En el curso de la acelerada revolución digital, es indispensable promover el acceso equitativo a la tecnología y diseñar iniciativas a la medida de las necesidades de cada población. Apoyar el acceso de los pueblos indígenas a las nuevas tecnologías es una prioridad en la región, no solo para cerrar las brechas de inclusión digital, sino también para avanzar hacia un siglo XXI más equitativo. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Ecuador for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Movimiento Indígena de Ecuador.
Señor presidente, soy Majo Andrade Cerda del pueblo quichua de Serena, en la Amazonía ecuatoriana. Apoyamos, esperamos y estamos dispuestos a cooperar para que este proceso permita mejorar la participación de pueblos indígenas en Naciones Unidas. No podemos seguir esperando otros 77 años para que los pueblos indígenas participemos en Naciones Unidas con un estatus propio, como lo que somos, como pueblos indígenas, y no como ONGs, voces terciarias que muchas veces pierden la esencia de nuestra voz. Es necesario iniciar este proceso a la brevedad posible, que sea siempre en coordinación estrecha con los pueblos indígenas y que concluya como parte de la adopción de la Conferencia Mundial sobre Pueblos Indígenas +10. Esperamos y confiamos que esta decisión sea adoptada este año por parte de la Asamblea General, por lo que es necesario tener consultas regionales y que en cualquier avance que se realice en el fortalecimiento de los pueblos indígenas esté representada la voz de los pueblos, del Abya Yala. Para ello, es crucial asegurar fondos que nos permita ser partes de estas reuniones. En este momento también tengo el honor y con todo respeto hablo por los pueblos amazónicos hermanos. En el caso de la nacionalidad zápara, tenemos que mencionar que fueron reconocidos por la UNESCO como Patrimonio Cultural de la Humanidad. Esto significa que tanto UNESCO como las demás agencias de Naciones Unidas deben trabajar conjuntamente con estas comunidades záparas para impulsar su agenda propia y que no desaparezca, ya que quedan unos cuantos habitantes de esta. Estas medidas deben ser respetuosas respecto al cambio climático, porque las naciones indígenas amazónicas están falleciendo lentamente. Y en contexto, la Amazonía está deforestándose de una manera aguda y el territorio zápara, uno de los más biodiversos del planeta, está falleciendo. Por eso es una necesidad que cada agencia de ONU, que se promueva también el reconocimiento como patrimonio cultural, no solo de nuestras nacionalidades, sino también nuestros ríos, nuestros cuerpos de agua, nuestros lugares sagrados, para que nadie los toque y podamos seguir adelante. Es un deber de los pueblos indígenas y de Naciones Unidas continuar este trabajo para que haya una mayor participación de los pueblos en general. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Movimiento Indígena de Ecuador for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Canada.
Thank you, Chair. We begin by acknowledging that we are on the traditional territory of the Lenape. We thank the President of the General Assembly for convening this session today and the distinguished panelists for their dedicated work in driving these issues forward. In line with the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the ALTA Outcome Document, the Outcome Document of the World Conference of Indigenous Peoples, and the Quito Outcome Document, Canada strongly believes that Indigenous peoples have the right to participate and be heard in decisions that affect them at the United Nations. The formalization of a mechanism for enhanced participation operationalizes an already existing right. Indigenous peoples' self-determination has been affirmed and reaffirmed continually by the United Nations General Assembly. This right to self-determination is defined in Common Article 1 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, and in the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada calls on the United Nations General Assembly to allow for Indigenous peoples' representative institutions to participate through the creation of a formal and distinct status. The process of enhanced participation must focus on Indigenous peoples based on their right to self-determination and cannot be conflated or confused with local communities and minorities. Additionally, this process should not undermine existing procedures that enable the participation of Indigenous peoples in the sessions of the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues and the Expert Mechanism on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. Canada would also like to stress that an increase in Indigenous peoples' participation must come with increased attention to reprisals, and safeguards must be in place to ensure that the United Nations General Assembly is a place of safety for all Indigenous peoples. It has also become clear over recent years that there is a strong need for better support for Indigenous peoples to engage on this topic, including financial support and capacity building. Canada is pleased to be a contributor to the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous Peoples, which plays a crucial role in enabling Indigenous peoples to participate in these discussions, and to have supported the Indigenous Coordinating Body that was established in Quito. Canada will continue to promote enhanced participation across the UN system, including, as we anticipate, a review conference for the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples. We are appreciative of this opportunity to engage in dialogue together today. Thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Canada for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Native Women's Association of Canada.
Good afternoon, Tansy. My name is Judy Hughes. This is Mel Critch with the Native Women's Association of Canada, and we're here to tell you that genocide is alive and well in Canada. 4 years ago, Canada had a national inquiry into Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA relatives, which outlined 231 calls for justice. Despite this national inquiry declaring a genocide, we continue to see Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA relatives go missing and being murdered in Canada at alarming rates. This genocide continues, and we have yet to see urgent action taken by the Canadian government, despite commitments made in their National Non-Action Plan. As the leading voice against ongoing genocide of Indigenous women and girls and 2S LGBTQIA relatives, the Native Women's Association of Canada makes great efforts to lobby the federal government to address the systemic violence against us. We work to end police brutality and profiling and the dumping of our sisters in garbage dumps and refusing to search for their remains. But we all need to work together to stop the violence and abuse against us. We must rise up. This is a call to action for everyone to take one more step to eliminate racial discrimination, because the status quo is not enough. We all have in our power the ability to make a difference. When we see discrimination, let's call it out. When we have the opportunity to change public policy, let's do so. When we are able to galvanize others into action, let's do so. Every day, every one of us must rise up against racial discrimination. This is one way that we can attempt to stop the violence against us and end the genocide. In the words of Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, wherever we see racism, we must condemn it without reservation, without hesitation, without qualification. Merci, merci, thank you, gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Native Women's Association of Canada, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Brazil.
Buenas tardes, senhor presidente. Me llamo Juliette Baré, sou do pueblo indígena Baré e membro da delegação oficial de Brasil, representante do recente criado Ministério dos Pueblos Indígenas de Brasil. Estou aqui como delegação oficial. Me gostaria de mencionar que é a primeira vez que o governo de Brasil está representado por pessoas indígenas em esta importante organização. Estamos aqui para reforçar nossa petição a todos da comunidade internacional aqui presente a respeito da grande importância do Brasil frente aos países do mundo e os esforços em proteger os direitos indígenas em Brasil e em todo o planeta. La defensa e la demarcação de los territórios indígenas e la proteção de la floresta. E seus biomas e la responsabilidade criminal de las pessoas e organizações responsáveis por la violência e os crimes contra os povos indígenas e o garimpo. O desmatamento e explorações ilegais da Amazônia. Estamos trabalhando junto ao novo governo de Brasil, escutando e colaborando com as organizações da sociedade civil e em setor privado para melhorar a colaboração de nosso país na luta contra a crise climática. E, por último, apoiamos a petição de Bolívia para que a ONU tenha representante dos povos indígenas na Assembleia Geral e assim ter nossas vozes ouvidas e ter poder de decisão na mesa de negociação especial em los temas que dizem respeito a nossa comunidade. Gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Brazil for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Tinhinan. I hope I read the name properly.
Merci, cher Président. Effectivement, vous avez bien prononcé. Nous vous remercions pour ça. Je félicite la présidence de l'Assemblée générale qui a continué ce processus avec mes collègues autochtones, représentants des autochtones et d'autres partis. Effectivement, je fais partie de ce comité global des peuples autochtones qui a travaillé sur l'organisation et la préparation de la conférence mondiale sur les peuples autochtones, dont ce point est inclus. Je m'en vais directement parler de ce qui concerne mon peuple, les Keltamachak, Touareg, qui se trouve dans la région du Sahel, en Afrique, et du Sahara. Il est urgent pour nous que cette participation soit vraiment effective et qu'elle déclenche le plus tôt que possible. Puisque, sans m'attarder sur ce qui nous arrive dans cette zone, dans cette région, où nous n'arrivons plus à vivre sur nos terroirs et nous sommes en grande majorité des déplacés, des réfugiés, même si nous avons une bonne partie d'entre nous qui résistent sur ces terroirs, tant bien que mal, avec toutes les situations difficiles possibles. Eh bien, nous pensons que notre situation ne peut se résoudre sans nous. Peut-être que ça se retarde aussi parce qu'on n'est pas là autour de la table quand les décisions se prennent et quand voilà, il y a question de mise en œuvre des mesures qui sont prises pour protéger les communautés comme nous. J'ai entendu différentes délégations, je les remercie, les délégations de mes sœurs et frères des autres peuples, mais aussi les délégations des États et les institutions. Je constate toujours, comme d'habitude, qu'on dit de belles phrases ici, on prend des décisions ici, dans ce bâtiment de l'Assemblée des Nations Unies. Cependant, sur le terrain, les choses ne descendent pas comme cela. Ça ne suit pas comme ça se dit ici et comme ça se recommande ici. Je souhaite vraiment que, vu notre situation, que les choses aillent jusqu'au terrain et que vraiment que ce qu'on dit ici se mette en œuvre effectivement. Et pour ce qui concerne même l'Afrique d'une façon générale, il y a des spécificités, comme certains l'ont dit, il y a des spécificités, nous n'avons pas tous la même situation. Nous, chez nous, la participation veut dire aussi qu'il faut la préparer. Nos institutions, elles existent, mais elles sont très affectées par ce qui nous est arrivé depuis la colonisation à nos jours. Il y a lieu de nous appuyer pour mieux nous organiser pour avoir la voix. Je vois par exemple nos frères du Conseil Sami, du Parlement Sami, etc. C'est fort possible que nous arrivons à nous comprendre avec nos institutions étatiques et avec les Nations Unies et autres acteurs pour y arriver, à ce que nous aussi on fasse pareil et qu'on soit prêts, comme nos autres frères et sœurs, à être présents auprès d'eux et à participer comme il le faut. Cependant, j'y reviens, il faut une préparation préalable. Il faut une préparation préalable et il faut un appui pour cela. Je vous remercie.
I thank the distinguished representative of Tinhinan for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Ejolina Thomas Foundation for the defense of the rights of the inhabitants of the Caribbean coast of Nicaragua.
Muchas gracias, señor presidente. Mi nombre es Carlos Henry Thomas, soy del pueblo Miskitu. Soy descendiente de los jefes hereditarios de la Mosquitia, más conocido como los reyes moscos o misquitos. Al comenzar, el señor presidente dijo palabras que nos da esperanza a todos los pueblos indígenas, al igual que el señor relator especial dijo, nos da mucha esperanza, aunque todavía, como dijo nuestro hermano Kenneth, muchos de los pueblos de la Mosquitia vive lo que vivió el líder Discaje. Nosotros en la Mosquitia tenemos garífonos, misquitus, uluas, mayacnas, ramas y afrodescendientes que viven en este territorio que no tienen voz, si no tiene una fundación o una organización para que pueda asistir a estas instancias. Y en estos momentos la situación en el estado de Nicaragua, todas las fundaciones o organizaciones han sido canceladas y ya no dan más oportunidad para estos lugares así. Y esto nos calla más que nunca la voz de todos estos pueblos que viven en una marginación y discriminación en el territorio de la Mosquitia. Y la burocracia de estas instancias, que si no tienes estas organizaciones no se puede registrar para poder llegar aquí. Eso nos hace más difícil para que estos pueblos sin voz puedan poder traer sus problemas ante este foro. El pueblo o los pueblos de la Mosquitia hoy vive una colonización interna que ha terminado con más de 1,5 millones de bosques, que el pueblo hoy está viviendo de una manera, una forma de miedo, que no duermen bien, comunidades enteras han sido desplazadas. Tenemos 79 líderes indígenas o comunales y activistas que han sido asesinados en Nicaragua. Uno de ellos es mi hijo Mark Rivas, un joven indígena que participó mucho en foros similares a esto. Y hoy su muerte ha quedado impune y no se ha escuchado hablar en estas instancias del nombre de mi hijo. Y esta situación lo está viviendo los pueblos Misquitu, Mayacna, Rama y los pueblos afrodescendientes en Nicaragua. Nosotros pedimos a esta instancia que obligue al Estado de Nicaragua a llevar a cabo la etapa de saneamiento de los pueblos indígenas, porque esto amenaza la vida de la vida misma de nuestros comunitarios. Nosotros no podemos salir, las mujeres no pueden salir, los hombres no pueden pescar, las mujeres no pueden ir a lavar ropa en los ríos, porque temen y viven amenazados y temen la muerte. Esa es la situación real de los pueblos de la Mosquitia hoy en Nicaragua. Hay muchas palabrerías bonitas, pero la realidad es totalmente diferente. Nosotros tenemos líderes impuestas por el gobierno. Si los líderes escogidos por el pueblo no tienen el reconocimiento del gobierno, no son electos, porque no están afines con el gobierno. Es la situación de mi pueblo. Nosotros pedimos que tomen conciencia que solo hablar no resuelve los problemas. Muchas gracias. No más amenaza y muerte al pueblo misquito. Muchas gracias a todos.
I thank the representative of Jolina Thomas Foundation for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Semila Warunkoa.
Me presento, mi nombre es María Vélez Medina Quiscue, soy indígena del pueblo Nasa de Colombia, víctima del conflicto armado que no cesa en nuestros territorios. Hace un año estuve aquí denunciando la situación de vulneración de derechos humanos hacia los 115 pueblos indígenas, pero sobre todo los que vivimos el conflicto armado y tenemos que llegar a las grandes ciudades. Esta crisis, hoy escuchando estos 4 días a todos los hermanos, me doy cuenta que la sabiduría de los pueblos indígenas, desde la medicina, la educación, deben de tener en cuenta porque los modelos de desarrollo económico hoy no cuidan nuestras vidas, no cuidan nuestro primer útero, que es nuestra Umaquiwe, nuestra madre tierra. Cuidar esto es cuidar la humanidad, cuidar a los pueblos indígenas que estamos dispuestos a aportar y a construir desde la sabiduría. Y por eso es tan importante salvaguardar el derecho de los pueblos y las comunidades del mundo. Recalcar la participación desde el ejercicio de nuestros sistemas de gobierno propio, porque es la base, la fundamental, la que está en peligro y la que quiere aportar a estos espacios y a las políticas que hoy construyen para el mundo. Hoy nuevamente aquí, después de un año y de firmar un acuerdo, el cual no ha avanzado, nos deja un resumen de 35 muertes en contexto de ciudad. Nos deja, de los cuales 22 son niños que no pasan de los 5 años. Nuevamente invitamos a nuestro gobierno, pero también al mundo, que cese la violencia y la vulneración de derechos humanos hacia los pueblos. Las instancias de participación y todos los escenarios deben de estar para nosotros los pueblos indígenas, porque queremos aportar a construir y a transformar. Las mujeres, los niños y el mundo hoy lo está diciendo, que no podemos seguir en esta condición porque vamos a exterminar la vida y la humanidad. Muchísimas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Semila Warunkoa for her statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Peru.
Señor presidente, quisiera en primer lugar agradecer por su intermedio al presidente de la Asamblea General por organizar esta tercera audiencia interactiva con los pueblos indígenas. Tras haber tenido que postergarla en más de una ocasión debido a las restricciones causadas por la pandemia de la COVID-19, es grato poder estar nuevamente reunidos de manera presencial junto a los representantes de los pueblos indígenas y sus organizaciones. Agradezco también las valiosas reflexiones del presidente del Foro Permanente para las Cuestiones Indígenas y de los panelistas. Señor presidente, para el Perú, la participación de los representantes de pueblos indígenas u originarios en las Naciones Unidas es muy importante. Nos guía la convicción de que el respeto a sus derechos requiere que los pueblos indígenas tengan una adecuada representación y participación en los asuntos públicos en todos los niveles, local, nacional e internacional. Agradecemos por ello el resumen oficioso elaborado por el órgano de coordinación indígena sobre el taller de expertos relativo al incremento de la participación de los pueblos indígenas en el Consejo de Derechos Humanos que organizó la Oficina del Alto Comisionado de las Naciones Unidas para los Derechos Humanos en noviembre de 2022. Asimismo, esperamos con atención el informe que presentará la Oficina del Alto Comisionado. Ambos documentos serán, sin duda, insumos de mucha utilidad para analizar conjuntamente el seguimiento de este importante tema. Señor presidente, En el mencionado taller de expertos, mi país reiteró su apoyo a la participación de los representantes de pueblos indígenas en los espacios y foros correspondientes en las Naciones Unidas. En aquella ocasión, recordamos que la adopción de la Declaración de las Naciones Unidas sobre los Derechos de los Pueblos Indígenas, uno de los hitos más importantes sobre el tema que hoy nos ocupa, fue el fruto de un proceso de negociación entre los Estados miembros en el que, con la activa participación de los representantes de los pueblos indígenas y de organizaciones intergubernamentales, se pudo lograr un adecuado balance entre las diferentes perspectivas e intereses. Por ello, creemos que la activa y dinámica participación de los pueblos indígenas en el proceso de elaboración y negociación de la declaración debe guiar las discusiones sobre la representación de los pueblos indígenas. En ese sentido, esta audiencia interactiva es un paso en la dirección correcta. El Perú, por tanto, continuará participando activamente en este proceso para que las voces de los pueblos indígenas sean escuchadas y sus derechos respetados, y así cumplir la promesa de la Agenda 2030 de no dejar a nadie atrás. Muchas gracias.
I thank the distinguished representative of Peru for his statement, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Indigenous Peoples Organization, Australia.
Thank you, Chair, distinguished representatives, sisters and brothers. Thank you for the opportunity to provide critical comments on these processes to enhance Indigenous participation at the UN. I'd also like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the ancestral lands of the Lenape peoples. I'm Kathy Eatock, a Garian Bachelor woman and co-chair of the Indigenous Peoples Organisation of Australia, and also Pacific member to the facilitative working group of the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform of the UNFCCC. Following the enforced break due to COVID, I'd like to take the opportunity to urge the General Assembly to renew these processes, to consider means to enhance Indigenous participation within United Nations mechanisms. This meeting must be the start of furthering these processes rather than the end of a process. The Conference of the Parties on Climate Change and the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform highlight both the tremendous value of Indigenous input into UN mechanisms in addressing the global challenges we face, but it also emphasises the difficulties in getting First Nations voices, experience and solutions heard in a highly competitive venue. It emphasises the importance of these processes on enhancing Indigenous participation. It emphasises that these processes need to continue. In relation to the modalities, we first and foremost need a specific Indigenous category. Indigenous peoples are not NGOs. Governance structures vary between regions with differing histories of colonisation, but we Indigenous peoples are all distinct from civil society organisations. We are Indigenous peoples with rights to self-determination. As Indigenous peoples, we have governance mechanisms with elected or traditionally appointed representatives. However, we need further engagement at a regional level to enable a greater level of discussion and input into the drafting of the modalities and accreditation criteria, so greater regional engagement is necessary. We also need to ensure that these processes are guided by the appointment of Indigenous advisors, such as Professor Claire Charters and Professor James Anaya, to progress these matters. I also want to take the opportunity to endorse the calls to mark the 10 years since the previous World Conference on Indigenous Peoples as timely to review the recommendations of the 2014 outcome document through the hosting of an Indigenous Peoples World Conference +10 in 2025. So to finish up, I call for a refresh of these processes to enable better engagement with Indigenous peoples and state members, and call for a recommendation for the hosting of a further World Conference on Indigenous Peoples be made and supported at the General Assembly in September 2023. Thank you, Chair.
I thank the distinguished representative of Indigenous Peoples Organization Australia, and I now give the floor to the distinguished representative of Silkoten National Government.
Danas, Sitzozi, Trevor Mack, Cledin Kot the Nineslin, Nakwasachanel Hiagulin. I come from the Tsailko, the Chilcotin River. Our name as Tsailkotin means people of the glacial rock river. And our government, the Tsailkotin National Government, is made up of 6 distinct communities that also call themselves Tsailkotin. And our governance is based upon our identity as Tsailkotin people, to steward and to take care of the land that gives our identity as Tsailkotin people. So our identity comes from the aspect that we can go into the water and drink the water, and that's our identity. And so when we talk about recognizing autonomous indigenous governance and the benefits that we can give to the United Nations and to our neighboring countries, is why wouldn't we do everything we possibly can to defend the very land in which our identity comes from and inspires our people to continue stewarding? And so why wouldn't we collaborate as much as we can with countries such as Canada, such as the United States? Why wouldn't we do that? And that's what I think the benefits of the autonomous indigenous governments can bring to the United Nations in tackling projects such as climate change and such as the problems of the future. And so Tsailkotin people, the people of the Glacial Rock River, our identity can't exist. The river can't exist without the glaciers that give existence to the lakes, that give existence to the river, that is connected to the ocean. So our identity is not just connected, compartmentalized. There aren't invisible lines that stop our governance. Our governance has for thousands of years been collaborating with other indigenous governments for thousands and thousands of years, that's connected spatially. And so, thank you.
I thank the distinguished representative of Chilcotin National Government. And now I give the floor to the distinguished representative of Winnemem Wintu Tribe.
Estem Chalit. I'm the chief of the Winnemem Wintu and the spiritual leader of this indigenous people, whose identity and cultural continuity is at the Bullampuyuk, Mount Shasta in California. We are the Winnemem Wintu tribe, are a U.S. unfederally recognized peoples. And we are a matriarchal and led traditionally with close ties to our sacred salmon. Winnemem Wintu continue to survive and strive to preserve Winnemem language, practice of Winnemem religion, traditional healing methods, and protect the rights of salmon, defend rights of few remaining sacred sites and ceremonial places and villages and burial grounds. Self-determination is not the only fundamental right serving as the backbone of the rights of indigenous people, but also to the UN Charter itself, Article 1. Herein, to develop friendly relations among nations based on the respect for the principle of equal rights and self-determination of peoples. An active contributing participants in both spoken and written formats to the expert workshop on possible ways to enhance the participation of indigenous peoples in the works of the Human Rights Council, held on the 21st and through the 24th of November 2022 in Geneva. The Winnemem Wintu stand firm in this and thus welcome the decision that indigenous peoples, including those who are not recognized or barred by the state, and those that are living traditionally and based on spiritual and traditional leadership and in accordance with their own traditions can do and will continue to choose and send our own representative persons of choice who we feel will best suit the interventions, negotiations, and whatever work needed. Representatives, delegates, including our chief, our spiritual knowledge holders, our youth, our chosen experts and practitioners, and whoever we deem fit to continue our values and meet our needs as representatives. Permanent observers status for indigenous peoples within the UN system in accordance with self-determination and self-identification, self-governance, and human rights, as well as the inclusion of unrecognized, non-recognized, and traditional indigenous institutions, peoples, and leadership in line with the UN Charter. And most importantly, its spirit, the spirit of the United Nations, to end genocide and other atrocities and realize human rights. It is also imperative that all nations of indigenous peoples have equal and equitable access to this new status within the United Nations, and the institute whose existence came to be in the wake of the World War II and the Holocaust to the eradication of forms of genocide, and most foundationally, but recognizing the implementation that rights of self-determination of peoples. Winnemem Wintu people support the timely and transparent participatory realization of the results of this process and a new status for indigenous peoples at the UN with respect to the equal and equitable rights of the self-determination of all indigenous people and in respect of human rights. Protections should be given to indigenous peoples with populations under 500 persons, U.S. unrecognized tribes and disenrolled tribal members. In light of this, we also look forward to the General Assembly convening of a high-level plenary meeting to be known as the World Conference on Indigenous Peoples +10 as a historical marker to the changes in the wind and underfoot. The time is now. We must come together. Our rights must be realized. Our future generations to end the genocides that have been forced upon us, to turn the pages of the dark eras of colonialism, and we have been surviving and survived, to recognize our humanity, our gifts, our friendship, needs and contributions, and legal, spiritual, plenary, and participatory human rights. Hichala Beskin. Thank you, President.
I thank the distinguished representative of Winnemem Wintu tribe for her statement. Before giving the floor, I now request the distinguished delegates to keep their time limit so that we'll have the interpreters. I now give the floor to the distinguished representative now, Inisiasi Maya Raket Adat.
Thank you, Chair. First of all, I would like to thank the UN Voluntary Fund for Indigenous people that support my participation in this important forum. Indigenous peoples often lack formal recognition over their land, territories, and natural resources, and face multiple barriers to participate fully in the formal economy, enjoy access to justice, and participate in political processes and decision-making. This legacy of inequality and exclusion has made indigenous peoples more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and natural disaster, including to the disease outbreak that we have facing, such as COVID-19. As my observation in this forum, challenges have been mentioned by mostly indigenous peoples in Asia is lack of recognition, and some issues like in other parts of the world, such as marginalization, poverty, disease, and violence. My comment is, do we need to have a forum to discuss, to revisit a definition of indigenous people as mentioned in ILO Convention C-169, Indigenous and Tribal Peoples Convention, 1989, or number 169, because this convention limited the definition of indigenous peoples. Why do we have to be distinguished from having been colonialized by colonialists and those who never been colonialized, whether or not it deserves to be called indigenous peoples, as has stated in the ILO Convention? I would like to mention briefly, the convention applies to tribal people in independent countries whose social, cultural, and economic condition distinguish from them from other sections of the national community, and then peoples in independent countries who are regarded as indigenous on account of their descent from the population which inhabited the country or geographical region to which the country belonged at the time of conquest, of colonization, or the establishment of present state boundaries, and who, irrespective of their legal status, retain some or all of their own social, economic, cultural, and political institution. And the second one, my comment is, how can UNDRIP be properly implemented, not just as a guideline or as the declaration for every country in the world? Terima kasih, thank you.
Thank you for your statement. In view of the lateness of the hour, I have to bring the interactive discussions to conclusion. Those participants who could not take the floor are invited to email their statements to e-statements@un.org for posting under e-statements in the United Nations Journal. I thank you for your cooperation. I thank participants for their intervention, and we have now concluded the interactive discussion. I'd like to express my appreciation to all participants in the informal interactive hearings for their invaluable insights and contribution to the deliberations. A summary of today's discussion will be circulated in due course. The informal interactive hearing with indigenous peoples is now concluded. The meeting is adjourned.